The first sensation was a lie. It was the feeling of warmth, a gentle caress like the Aegean sun on bare skin. But there was no sun, no skin. There was only dust and memory, a billion scattered motes of what had once been. For millennia, she had been less than a ghost, a name whispered in fear, a story told to frighten children. She was a head, severed and wielded as a weapon, her final, petrifying scream frozen on lifeless lips. She was an echo. Now, the echo was gathering. The warmth was a thread of divine will, an unfamiliar energy pulling the scattered dust of her being back into a singular point. It was an agonizing process, a reversal of a final, bloody dissolution. Each particle screamed as it was torn from the soil of Sarpedon, the isle of her long death. They scraped against the granite bones of the island, ripped from the roots of withered olive trees, and drawn from the salt-caked seabed where they had settled like forgotten sins. It was the pain of a universe contracting, of a star being born from cold, dead gas. Slowly, form followed feeling. An outline sketched itself in the air above the crumbling ruins of her ancient lair. A torso, slender and strong, limbs long and elegant. It was a shape she vaguely remembered, a dream from a life before the curse. The dust coalesced, swirling into a dense gray cloud that began to solidify. The gray became the pale cream of marble, then softened, blushing with the phantom heat of blood. Nerves sparked, knitting themselves together with threads of golden light. Muscle wove itself over a framework of bone that hardened from mist into substance. She took a breath. The air was a shock, sharp and briny, filled with the scent of sea spray and decay. It flooded lungs that hadn't existed a moment before, a raw, painful gasp that was the first sound she had made in 3,000 years. Her eyes snapped open. The world was a blur of gray rock and a churning leaden sky. There was no hiss, no writhing weight upon her scalp. The thought came with a jolt of pure, unadulterated panic. They are gone. Her hands, slender and pale, flew to her head. They met not a nest of coiling, venomous serpents, but a cascade of soft, heavy hair. It felt like spun obsidian, cool and smooth against her trembling fingertips. She pulled a lock before her eyes. It was the color of a starless midnight, catching the dim light with an oily sheen. Gone were the vipers, the constant, hateful whispering, the symbiotic curse that had been her crown and her cage. The silence in her own mind was deafening. She pushed herself up, her new body clumsy and untested. Her limbs trembled with the effort, the muscles still learning their purpose. She stood on unsteady feet amidst the rubble of her own history. The stones around her were her only witnesses, silent and eternal. Some were just rocks, worn smooth by wind and time. Others were more detailed. A sailor, his hand outstretched for a rope that was no longer there. A warrior, his shield raised, his face a mask of terror that had outlasted his bronze. Her victims. Her only companions in death. A flicker of movement at the edge of her vision. A small gray lizard skittered over a fallen pillar. Instinct, ancient and deeply buried, flared within her. Her eyes locked onto the creature. She felt a power well up behind them, a familiar, terrible pressure. She waited for the inevitable, the stiffening of limbs, the slow leaching of color, the transformation from life to stone. But nothing happened. The lizard paused, its throat pulsating, and then darted away into a crack in the rock. She blinked. The pressure behind her eyes receded, coiling back into itself like a serpent settling into slumber. It was still there, the terrible gift of Athena's rage, but it was quiet. It was hers. It did not act. It waited to be commanded. The realization was a tectonic shift in the landscape of her soul. The curse had been broken, reforged into a tool. She stumbled towards a tidal pool, tracked in a basin of rock. The water was still and dark, a perfect, unforgiving mirror. For a long moment, she simply stared at the stranger who stared back. The face was hers, but not hers. It was the face she'd had as a girl, a priestess in Athena's temple, before the salt stink of the sea god, before the violation on the cold temple floor, before the fury of the virgin goddess had descended upon her. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, a mouth that remembered how to pray, but had forgotten how to smile. And her eyes, they were the color of viridian, the deep, impossible green of the sea after a storm. They held the memory of stone, the chill of eternity, but they did not burn with untethered power. They watched, they judged, they chose. Who had done this? Who had called her back from the scattered oblivion of myth? The warmth she'd first felt still lingered, a single, pure note humming at the core of her being. It was not the capricious, cruel power of the Olympians she knew. It was something older, something chthonic, a power that slumbered in the earth and resented the sky gods and their petty dramas. It was the power of grievances left to fester, of injustices that had stained the very soil. It was the power of nemesis, of vengeance itself, and it had found its perfect instrument. Her name, she remembered, was Medusa. They had made it a synonym for monster. They had taken her devotion, her body, her life, and then they had stolen her very identity, replacing it with a caricature of horror. Her gaze lifted from the pool, across the gray waves, towards a world that had spun on without her. A world that had forgotten her truth, but clung to the monster of its own making. A world where the gods still played their games, and men still followed the examples of their brutal, heroic slayers. Perseus. The name was not a memory, but a fresh wound. The glint of his polished shield, the cold, triumphant look in his eyes as he avoided hers, the sharp, searing agony of the adamantine sickle at her throat, the final, sickening drop as her head was severed from her body, her last sight the view of her own bleeding stump. He had been celebrated, lauded as a hero for butchering a victim. He had founded dynasties on the glory of her murder, wielding her agony as his personal weapon. A cold, geologic pressure began to build in her chest. It was a rage so profound and so ancient, it felt like it could crack the foundations of the world. It was not the hot, panicked fury of the monster in the cave, but the patient, grinding wrath of a goddess. A sound carried on the wind, interrupting her reverie. The creak of wood, the snap of canvas, the distant shouts of men. A ship was rounding the headland, a single-masted trader with a patched sail and a hull dark with pitch. It was making for the small, sheltered cove on the far side of the island. Mortals. They still came, drawn by the legends of treasure, of a monster's hoard. So little had changed. She began to walk, her bare feet silent on the ancient stone. Her movements were fluid now, infused with a purpose that banished all awkwardness. She was not the girl who had served Athena. She was not the monster who had been slain by Perseus. She was the third thing, the consequence. The men who came ashore were loud and coarse, 5 of them, their faces weathered by sun and sea. They carried rusting swords and greedy eyes, kicking at the rubble, searching for gold or forgotten relics. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a tangled black beard, pointed towards the entrance of her ruined temple. "There," he grunted. "The old stories say the snake witch's lair was in the heart of the temple. That's where the real treasure will be. The offerings from the fools she turned to stone." Medusa watched them from the shadows of a weathered rock formation. She felt the power behind her eyes stir, hungry and eager. She could turn them all to statues before they took another step. It would be easy, just, but it was not enough. A gallery of frozen terror was the art of the monster. A goddess required a more potent statement. She let them enter the crumbling edifice, their voices echoing in the sacred space she had once tended. She followed, a shadow in the gloom. The men lit a torch, its flickering light casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. They found a small stone chest, its lid long since rotted away. Inside, a few tarnished silver coins and a necklace of lapis lazuli. The bearded captain snatched the necklace. "This is it, a few trinkets," he roared, his voice thick with disappointment. He turned and kicked at a nearby statue, the stone form of a young warrior from an age long past. Worthless junk. That was the moment Medusa chose. She stepped from the shadows. "The junk has more worth than your miserable soul," she said. Her voice was not a hiss, but it held the chilling resonance of stone grinding against stone. The men spun around, swords drawn. They saw not a monster, but a woman of terrifying beauty, her black hair a void in the torchlight, her green eyes seeming to glow with their own internal luminescence. The captain's fear warred with his avarice. "Who are you?" he demanded, though his knuckles were white on his sword's hilt. "I am the guard." The remaining 4 men stood frozen, not by her power, but by a terror so pure and primal it had seized control of their muscles. The torchlight flickered across their faces, each a mask of disbelief. The air grew thick and cold, smelling of ozone and the dust of freshly made stone. One of the men, a wiry sailor with terrified eyes, dropped his sword. It clattered on the floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden, ringing silence. The captain, whose name was Lycaon, did not drop his weapon. His knuckles were bloodless, his arm trembling, but he held the blade pointed towards her. His mind, a crucible of fear and avarice, was struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. This was not the creature of legend. There were no snakes, no monstrous visage. There was only a woman whose beauty was an affront, a weapon in itself, and whose eyes promised an ending colder and more final than any blade. What sorcery is this?" he stammered, his voice a dry rasp. Medusa took a step forward, her bare feet making no sound. The movement was grace and threat combined. "It is not sorcery. It is a correction." Her gaze remained on him, but her awareness encompassed them all. She could feel the frantic hammering of their hearts, the sweat beading on their skin. "You come to my home. You seek to steal from my dead. You kick at their tombs and call them junk." She tilted her head, a gesture of cold curiosity. "And you wonder why you are corrected?" She let her eyes drift to the statue of the screaming man. His expression was now part of the permanent gallery of her long solitude. "I could have done that to all of you in the space of a single heartbeat. Your souls snuffed out before your brains could even register the shock. She looked back at Lycaon. I chose not to. You should be grateful. Gratitude, however, is not what I require. Lycaon swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling like sun-baked clay. What do you want? Gold? We have none. The necklace, you can have it. He held out the lapis lazuli, a trembling offering. Medusa's lips curved in a smile that held no warmth, only the chill of the abyss. Your trinkets are worthless to me. She glided closer, stopping only a few feet from the tip of his sword. She ignored the blade completely, her focus entirely on the hand that held the necklace. But that bauble belonged to a princess of Crete, who thought her beauty could shield her from my gaze. It did not. You hold a piece of a story you do not understand. She raised her own hand, palm up. It was a command, not a request. Give it to me. Hesitantly, his eyes darting between her face and his petrified crewman, Lycaon placed the necklace in her hand. Her skin was cool, like marble that had lain in shadow. As her fingers closed around the lapis stones, his own fingers suddenly seized up. A gasp escaped his lips. He watched in horror as the skin on the back of his hand lost its color, turning a mottled gray. The texture changed, the flesh hardening, the fine hairs becoming tiny, rigid filaments. The petrification crawled to his wrist and then stopped, leaving him with one hand of flesh and one of stone. He screamed, a high, thin sound of utter panic. The other 3 men scrambled backwards, tripping over rubble in their haste to put distance between themselves and the unfolding horror. I can take it back, Medusa said, her voice calm and even amidst his terror. She examined the necklace, then let it drop to the floor. The sound of it striking the stone was like a final judgment. Or I can continue. Your throat, your lungs, your terrified, greedy heart. It is all the same to me. It is a matter of will. My will. Lycaon cradled his stone hand, his breath coming in ragged sobs. Please, goddess, please. The word hung in the air. Goddess. It felt right. It felt earned. You will answer my questions, she commanded, her voice leaving no room for refusal. The world has spun on while I slept. I need to know what has become of it. What of the gods? Does Zeus still rule from his mountain? Does Athena still preach wisdom while nursing her petty jealousies? The captain stared at her, his mind reeling. The gods, they are stories, myths. People build temples, yes, but no one has seen them in an age. They are matters for priests and poets. A flicker of something, surprise, contempt, crossed Medusa's face. The Olympians had faded into legend. Their glorious, terrible reign, reduced to bedtime stories. The thought was both amusing and deeply satisfying. Their power had always been rooted in the belief of mortals. Without it, they were just echoes, like she had been. Good, she said softly. And what of the heroes? What of the slayers of monsters? She leaned in, her viridian eyes pinning him, searching his soul. What of Perseus? Lycaon flinched at the name. Perseus? The founder of Mycenae? He is the greatest of the old heroes, a legend known to every child, the man who slew the Gorgon, Medusa. He said her name without thinking, a venomous word from a story he'd heard 100 times.
He realized his mistake an instant later, his face draining of what little color it had left. The air in the temple dropped another 10 degrees. "He slew no one," Medusa whispered, the sound a low vibration that seemed to come from the stones themselves. "He murdered a woman who had already been broken. He was a coward with a mirrored shield and a stolen sword. A butcher who called his victim a monster to aggrandize his crime." She traced a finger along his jawline, and he shuddered violently but dared not pull away. "His legacy. I want to know about his legacy. Mycenae, his descendants, where are they?" "Mycenae is dust," Lycaon choked out, "a ruin for shepherds to graze their flocks. His line, the stories say it ended in blood and madness centuries ago. Agamemnon, Orestes, it was a cursed house." A cold smile touched Medusa's lips. It seemed Nemesis had already been at work, but it wasn't enough. A cursed house was not the same as a debt paid in full. The story had to be unwritten. The hero had to be unmade. "The story is what matters," she mused, more to herself than to him. "His name is remembered with honor, mine with horror. That is the injustice I have returned to correct." She straightened up, her decision made. She looked past the terrified captain to the other 3 men huddled by the entrance. "You 3, you have a ship." They nodded dumbly. "It is my ship now. You will take me to the mainland, to Argos." Argos, the heart of the Peloponnese, the seat of the kingdom Perseus had once ruled. It was the logical place to start pulling at the threads of his legend. Lycaon found a sliver of courage. "And what of us, goddess? What happens when we reach Argos?" Medusa's gaze returned to him. "One of you," she said, her eyes sweeping over the 3 sailors by the door, "will have the great honor of becoming my herald. You will go to the agora in Argos. You will go to the temples and the forums." The journey across the wine-dark sea was a study in silence. The ship, once a vessel of coarse laughter and bawdy songs, became a floating chapel of fear. The 2 remaining sailors, a gaunt man named Philon and a boy barely old enough for a beard named Iason, moved with the quiet, desperate efficiency of mice in a serpent's den. They reefed the sail, coiled the ropes, and manned the tiller without a single wasted word, their eyes perpetually fixed on their task, their rigging, or the horizon, anywhere but on the woman who stood at the prow. Medusa did not sit. She stood as motionless as the statues she left in her wake, her black hair a banner against the gray sky, her gaze fixed on the unseen shores of the Peloponnese. The sea air, the domain of her first tormentor, no longer felt like a violation. It was merely air. The waves, the physical manifestation of Poseidon's might, no longer held any terror. They were merely water. She felt a profound and chilling detachment, as if she were viewing the world through a sheet of flawless, unbreakable crystal. She was in it, but no longer of it. The passions and fears that ruled the mortal world were abstract concepts to her now, data to be analyzed and exploited. Lycaon, the captain, stood near the mast, his stone hand a constant, aching weight that dragged at his shoulder. He could feel the cold of it seeping into his arm, a creeping numbness that he feared would eventually claim him entirely. He was her designated interlocutor. The sailors would not speak to her, and she seemed to have no interest in them. It was him she would occasionally address, her voice cutting through the whisper of the wind without ever rising in volume. "Tell me of Argos," she commanded on the second day, her back still to him. "Tell me of its people. Do they still offer sacrifice on blood-soaked altars? Do they still praise the courage of butchers and call it heroism?" Lycaon's throat was dry. "It is the city of the wolf, goddess, a center of trade. Its people are merchants, artisans, soldiers. They are proud. They honor the old tales. The Acropolis has a shrine to Perseus. His shield, the one he used to find you, is said to be enshrined there, a gift from the goddess Athena herself." A tremor, almost imperceptible, ran through Medusa's frame. The shield, the instrument of her death, now an object of veneration. The irony was so bitter it was almost a physical taste. "A shrine," she repeated softly. "They worship the tool of a murder, fitting for a world built by cowards." She finally turned, her viridian eyes locking onto his. "And Athena, does she have a temple there?" "The grandest in the city," Lycaon said, forcing himself not to look away. To meet her gaze felt like leaning over the edge of a cliff. "The temple of Athena Promachos, the champion. They say it is built on the very spot where the hero first displayed your—" he faltered, the word head dying on his lips. "My agony," she finished for him, her voice devoid of emotion. "He displayed my agony, and they built a temple to his patron, to the very goddess who cursed me for being a victim. The symmetry is almost poetic." She looked away again, toward the approaching clouds on the horizon. "The stories they tell, they are the bedrock of their world. Pry one stone loose, and the entire edifice will tremble." That evening, the sky turned a bruised purple. The sea, which had been placid, grew agitated, its surface chopping into 1,000 sharp, angry peaks. The wind began to howl through the rigging, a mournful shriek that scraped at the nerves. Phylon and Ison worked frantically, their faces pale in the dying light, securing lines and lowering the sail. This was no ordinary squall. It was a sudden, violent tempest that seemed to boil up from the depths of the sea itself. A wave, monstrous and black, slammed against the side of the ship, sending a torrent of icy water across the deck. Iason screamed as he was torn from his feet and washed towards the gunwale. Lycaon, his one good hand gripping the mast, shouted his name in a panic. The ship groaned, its timbers straining against the assault. It felt personal. The sea was not just stormy, it felt enraged. Medusa remained unmoved at the prow, the wind whipping her hair into a frenzy, the sea spray soaking her simple gray chiton. She lifted her face to the gale, her eyes closed, as if tasting the storm's essence. She could feel him in it, an echo.
A residual rage left behind in his domain. Poseidon, the earth-shaker, the memory of his crushing weight, the smell of salt and divine ichor, the searing pain. It was all there, woven into the fabric of the wind and water. The monster in the cave would have screamed in terror. The girl in the temple would have wept. The goddess did neither. She opened her eyes. The pressure that had once been a curse, the power to turn flesh to stone, was a focused point of will within her. But Nemesis had gifted her more than a repurposed curse. She was an avatar of consequence, and her will was now a law of nature. "Be still," she said. Her voice was not loud. It was not a shout to rival the storm. It was a quiet, firm command, spoken with an authority so absolute that the universe had no choice but to obey. It was the voice of a mountain telling the wind to part. The howling gale did not simply die down, it ceased to exist. One moment it was a physical blow, threatening to rip the mast from the deck. The next, there was only a profound and unnatural silence. The churning waves, cresting in towers of black water, lost their momentum. They did not settle or subside, they froze, their peaks and troughs hardening into a solid, undulating landscape of glassy, dark water. The ship rested in a trough between two motionless waves, each the size of a hill, suspended in a moment of impossible tranquility. Raindrops hung in the air like a beaded curtain of crystal. Lycaon, Phelon, and Iason stared, their minds unable to process the sensory blasphemy. They were in the heart of a hurricane that had been paused, suspended, executed. Phelon, who had been making the sign against evil, found his hand frozen in mid-gesture. Iason lay in a puddle on the deck, his mouth open in a scream that had been silenced. Medusa took a slow breath. Her power had answered her, but the effort had cost her. It was a deep, resonant exhaustion, like the fatigue of a mountain after an earthquake. She had not commanded the sea itself, she realized. She had imposed her will upon the space the ship occupied, creating a bubble of perfect, ordered stasis. A sanctuary of her rage, carved out of the chaos of another's. She walked across the deck, her footsteps the only sound in the frozen world. She stopped beside Lycaon. He flinched, his eyes wide with a new kind of terror, not just fear of a monster, but the soul-crushing awe one feels before a true god. The gods you have forgotten still have echoes, she said, her voice a low murmur. Their passions stain the world, like wine on a stone floor, but they are just stains. They can be scoured away. She looked at the terrified sailors, their fear a palpable thing in the air. Her plan had been to use two of them as statues, as proof. She saw now that there was a better way. Fear was a powerful tool, but belief was a weapon. She raised her hand, and the world lurched back into motion. The wind returned, but as a gentle breeze. The waves collapsed into a soft, rolling swell. The suspended raindrops fell in a brief, gentle shower. The storm was gone, not weathered, but dismissed. Phelon and Iason collapsed onto the deck, weeping with relief and terror. Lycaon simply stared at her, his one good hand trembling uncontrollably. "You will all be my heralds," Medusa announced, her voice resonating with newfound power. "When we reach Argos, you will not speak of a monster. You will speak of the goddess who commanded the sea, who silenced the rage of Poseidon himself. You will not tell them a story. You will deliver a prophecy. Lycaon, you will show them your hand and tell them it is the mark of a power that can unmake the world. Phelon, you will describe the storm that died at her command. And Iason," she said, her gaze fallen upon the boy, who looked up, his face streaked with tears and salt water, "you will tell them of her eyes. You will tell them that in her eyes you did not see a monster's curse, but the promise of a new and terrible justice." She turned back to the prow. In the distance, a faint smudge of land was visible against the horizon. Argos. The port of Argos was a riot of life, a chaotic symphony of smells and sounds that assaulted Medusa's heightened senses. The reek of fish guts and cheap wine mingled with the scent of sawdust, sweat, and baking bread. The air, thick with humidity and the chatter of a dozen dialects, felt coarse and abrasive in her newly formed lungs. Men with sun-scorched skin and arms like knotted ropes hauled amphorae from creaking ships, their shouts and curses weaving a rough tapestry of commerce. It was a world teeming with the messy, vibrant, and utterly fragile ephemera of mortal life. To Medusa, it was like observing an anthill, a flurry of meaningless activity on the cusp of being crushed underfoot. Her ship, the sea serpent as Lycaon had called it, drifted into its mooring like a ghost. No one hailed them. The dock workers who glanced their way saw the tattered sail and the splintered railing, but then they saw the crew. They saw 3 men, their faces ashen, their movements stiff with a terror that went beyond the fear of a difficult voyage. They saw a captain whose right hand was a grotesque sculpture of gray stone. And finally, their eyes would land on the woman at the prow, and their voices would falter. Medusa descended the gangplank first. Her bare feet met the sun-warmed wood of the docks, and a hush began to spread from her position outwards. It was not a silence of respect, but of profound, instinctual unease. The dock workers stopped their work. The merchants paused their haggling. A child, chasing a stray dog, skidded to a halt, his laughter dying in his throat as he looked upon her. She was a figure of impossible beauty, and even more impossible dread, a living statue carved from moonlight and malice, her viridian eyes taking in the world with an unnerving, predatory stillness. Lycaon and his men followed, their feet shuffling on the planks. They were not her retinue, they were her exhibits. The captain held his stone hand in front of him, not to hide it, but as if compelled to display the proof of his damnation. "The agora," Medusa said, her voice a low command that only the 3 men could hear. "Lead me." Lycaon nodded, a puppet whose strings had been pulled. He began to walk, his gait unsteady, pushing through the stunned onlookers who parted before him as if he were a leper. Phelon and Iason flanked him, their eyes wide and darting, like animals trapped in a waking nightmare. Medusa followed several paces behind, a queen in a procession of the damned. Their journey from the port to the city's heart was a spectacle of creeping horror. As they moved through the narrow, crowded streets, a wave of silence rolled ahead of them. People flattened themselves against the walls of their shops and homes. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer ceased. The melody of a flute was cut short. All eyes were drawn to the beautiful, terrible woman and her terrified heralds. Whispers followed in her wake, like the rustling of dry leaves. Who is she? A foreign queen? A sorceress? Look at that man's hand. By the gods, what is that? Medusa ignored them all. She absorbed the details of Argos with cold precision. She saw the crudely carved phalluses for luck, the offerings of wilting flowers at small household shrines, the graffiti mocking a local politician. She saw the symbols of the Olympians everywhere, the eagle of Zeus, the trident of Poseidon, the lyre of Apollo. And most of all, she saw the owl. It was carved into lintels, stamped onto pottery, worn as pendants around the necks of women, the ubiquitous, staring sigil of her tormentor, Athena. Each one was a small, fresh insult. The agora was a wide, open square paved with limestone, bustling with citizens, merchants, and off-duty soldiers. At its center stood a large fountain, and on its far side the imposing marble facade of the temple of Athena Primordial gleamed in the afternoon sun. It was here Lycaon finally stopped, his nerve failing him. He turned to Medusa, his face a plea for release. She gave him a slight, almost imperceptible nod. This was the stage. Lycaon drew a ragged breath. He climbed onto the lip of the fountain, his stone hand held high for all to see. The crowd, already buzzing with rumor about the strange arrivals, fell silent and gathered to watch. "People of Argos!" he cried out, his voice cracking with a fear that made his words all the more compelling. "Listen to me! We come from the Isle of Sarpedon. We went seeking treasure, like fools." His voice broke into a half-sob. "We found no gold. We found a truth that has slept for 3,000 years." A murmur went through the crowd. Sarpedon, the Gorgon's Isle, a place of dark legend. "The stories are lies," Lycaon screamed, pointing a trembling, fleshy finger at Medusa, who stood motionless at the edge of the square. "They told us of a monster, a beast with snakes for hair. But the monster was a hero's invention, a lie to cover a murder." He brandished his stone hand. "This is not the work of a monster. This is the mark of a goddess. I defied her, and she showed me the smallest fraction of her power. My hand is stone, but she could have turned the very air I breathe to rock." Phelon, emboldened by terror, stepped forward. "I saw it. We were caught in a storm sent from the blackest pit of the sea, a gale that would have torn our ship to splinters. She spoke a single word, and the storm died. The waves froze. The wind obeyed her." Then Yasin, the boy, his face pale and tear-streaked, pointed directly at Medusa. "Her eyes! I looked into her eyes. There is no curse there. There is judgment. It is the end of the world and the beginning of the world, all in her gaze." The crowd was a sea of rapt, frightened faces. They were captivated, horrified, and confused. The performance was raw, believable, and utterly insane. Then, a new voice cut through the tension, cold and authoritative. "Enough of this madness." A man pushed his way through the crowd. He was tall, severe, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and robes of pristine white linen. An intricate golden owl was embroidered on his breast. He was Orpheon, the high priest of the Temple of Athena. He radiated an aura of smug, unshakable authority. "Blasphemous street theater," Orpheon declared, his eyes sweeping over the sailors with contempt before settling on Medusa. He looked her up and down, a flicker of appreciation for her beauty warring with his disdain. "A foreign witch and her band of crazed sailors come to our city to spin wild tales. You profane this sacred square with your lies." Medusa met his gaze. It was the first time she had directly engaged anyone since stepping ashore. "A lie is a story told to hide a truth," she said. "My story is the truth that has come to unmask the lies your city is built upon." Orpheon scoffed. "Our city is built upon the glory of the gods and the heroism of our founders. It is built upon the deeds of the great Perseus, who cleansed the world of a vile monster. You dare to question the foundations of our very civilization?" "I am the foundation," Medusa replied, the words resonating with geological authority. "I am the stone that was discarded, returned to judge the house that was built." The priest laughed, a short barking sound. "Words. Any charlatan can speak in riddles. You claim the power of a goddess, then show us a sign, not the testimony of these frightened fools. A true sign. Strike me down if you can. Or better yet, call upon your supposed power to shatter the doors of Athena's temple. Prove your claim."
He spread his arms wide, a picture of arrogant challenge. "Or will you slink back to your ship, your bluff called?" Medusa's lips curved into that chilling, mirthless smile. "Striking you down would be a mercy. I am not here to offer mercy." Her eyes did not flare with power. There was no visible change, but she focused her will, not on the priest, but on the symbol of his authority, the golden owl embroidered on his chest. Orpheon felt a sudden, intense cold spread across his breastbone. He looked down. The crowd gasped, a single, collective intake of breath. The fine golden threads of the embroidered owl were changing. The soft fabric was stiffening, the color deepening, the texture altering. With an audible, faint grinding sound, the threads turned to solid metal, then darkened, losing their luster, transforming into the dull, veined gray of granite. The intricate embroidery became a perfect miniature stone carving, an owl of solid rock fused to the priest's robes. The weight of it, sudden and real, pulled his vestments taut. Orpheon stared, his mouth agape. He reached out a trembling hand and touched it. It was cold. It was hard. It was stone. It was impossible. He stumbled back, his face a mask of horrified disbelief. The agora remained a tableau of suspended disbelief. Orpheon, the high priest, staggered back, his face the color of old parchment. His hand, which had been clutching the stone owl on his chest, now flew to his mouth as if to stifle a blasphemy or a cry of pure, unadulterated terror. He was a man whose entire world, a meticulously constructed edifice of ritual and divine order, had just been proven to be made of sand, and the tide was coming in. He turned, his dignity shattered, and practically fled, pushing through the stunned populace with the graceless haste of a common thief. He did not run towards the sanctuary of his temple, but away from it, towards the halls of the city's archons. This was no longer a matter for priests, it was a matter for soldiers. Medusa watched him go, a flicker of contempt in her eyes. He was predictable. Men like him never fought the storm itself. They ran to build higher walls, hoping the tide would not reach them. Her attention returned to the crowd. They were no longer a mob, but a collection of individuals, each locked in their own private sphere of fear. They stared at her, then at Lycaon's stone hand, then at the grand temple doors, connecting the 3 points into a terrifying implication. She had not come to parley, she had not come to preach, she had come to conquer. Without another word, she began to walk. The sea of people did not part for her. It receded, a human tide pulling back from an unnatural shore. They scrambled backwards, tripping over market stalls and abandoned baskets of olives, their whispers now replaced by a rustling, shuffling panic. She walked through the space they created, a corridor of fear, her pace unhurried, her bare feet silent on the limestone flags that had been warmed by a sun she could no longer feel. Her path led directly up the wide marble steps of the Temple of Athena Promachos. At the top, flanking the colossal bronze doors, stood 2 guards in gleaming breastplates and plumed helmets. They were Argive hoplites, veterans of skirmishes with Sparta, men who understood fear and discipline in equal measure. They held their ground, their 8-foot spears leveled, their knuckles white around the ash-wood shafts. Their training warred with the primal instinct screaming at them to run. One of them, a captain with scars bracketing his mouth, found his voice. "Halt! This is a sacred place. You will come no further, demon!" Medusa did not stop. She continued her ascent, her gaze lifting to meet theirs. She felt the power behind her eyes, that familiar cold pressure, but she held it in check. Statues were a statement of ending. She was here to make a statement of dominion. She focused her will not on the men, but on their tools. As she reached the top step, the bronze spearheads in front of her began to change. The polished metal, which had glinted in the sun, dulled to a matte, pitted gray. The sharp points drooped, the metal losing its integrity, sagging like warm wax. In the space of 2 heartbeats, the deadly tips of their spears transformed into heavy, useless lumps of lead, pulling the spear shafts down towards the ground. The guards stared, their mouths agape. The captain tried to lift his weapon, but the sudden, unnatural weight was too much. The entire shaft bent with a groan, the wood splintering under the strain. He dropped it with a clatter. His companion did the same, his face a mask of pure shock. Their swords remained in their scabbards. They understood, with a clarity that defied all reason, that drawing them would be a futile, final act. Medusa walked between them. She did not spare them a glance. They were irrelevant, their courage and their weapons meaningless before a power that could rewrite the laws of nature. She placed her hands on the massive bronze doors, which depicted scenes from Perseus's life, his birth, his quest, and his triumphant return, her own severed head held aloft. The cold metal felt like a deep, resonant insult. She pushed. The doors, which took 4 acolytes to move, swung inward with a low, mournful groan, as if the temple itself was sighing in defeat. The air that rolled out to meet her was cool and still, thick with the scent of frankincense, myrrh, and the faint, metallic tang of old blood from the sacrificial altar. It was a smell she remembered from a lifetime ago, a scent of piety and peace that was now forever entwined with the memory of violation.
For a single, vertiginous moment, the goddess receded, and the girl, the priestess, stood on the threshold of her home and her tomb. A phantom ache radiated from the back of her neck. The cold marble floor seemed to rise up to meet her, a memory of pain imprinted on a body that had not even existed when it was inflicted. She crushed the sensation with the sheer force of her will. That girl was dust. The goddess remained. She stepped inside. The great hall, the cella, was a cavern of polished marble and shadow. Light filtered down from high clerestory windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the sacred silence. Along the walls, priceless tapestries depicted Athena's wisdom and her martial victories. Votive offerings of gold, silver, and ivory gleamed in alcoves. It was a treasury of devotion, a monument to a goddess who had rewarded her most devout priestess with damnation. And at the far end of the hall, dominating the space, was the statue. It was a chryselephantine colossus, 30 feet tall. A core of wood, she knew, clad in plates of carved ivory for the skin, and sheets of pure gold for the robes, the helmet, and the aegis that covered her breast. The goddess stood in full battle regalia, a 6-foot golden spear in one hand, her other resting on a shield that stood beside her. Her ivory face was a mask of serene, implacable wisdom. Her eyes, made of polished sapphires, seemed to stare down at Medusa with cold, eternal judgment. On the aegis, wrought in the gold, was a Gorgon's head,
its face a caricature of monstrous rage, its mouth open in a silent, bestial scream, its hair a mass of writhing, golden snakes. It was a mockery of her curse, worn as a trophy by the very being who had inflicted it. Medusa walked slowly down the length of the hall, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of her own breathing and the frantic, terrified whimpering of someone trying not to be heard. Her eyes scanned the shadows near the base of the statue. She saw a flicker of white fabric behind a massive marble pillar. A witness. Good. A story is not a story without someone left to tell it. She stopped 10 feet from the statue, at the edge of the sacrificial dais. She looked up at the serene, ivory face, at the sapphire eyes that had once watched, impassive, as Poseidon took her on this very floor. "Did you think I would shatter you?" Medusa whispered, her voice a low vibration in the still air. "Did you think I would tear down your temple, pillar by pillar? That is the act of a monster, Athena, a creature of blind rage. I am not what you made me." She raised a hand, palm outward, towards the statue. "I am a correction." The power that flowed from her was not a torrent, but a quiet, inexorable river. It was not aimed at the whole statue, but at specific, symbolic points. The golden spear in Athena's hand began to change. The metal softened, flowing like honey, and the straight, martial shaft twisted and coiled upon itself. Scales of gold rippled across its surface. The leaf-shaped spearhead flattened and split, forming a forked, flickering tongue. In moments, the symbol of the goddess of war's might was no longer a spear. It was a great, golden serpent coiled around the statue's arm, its head resting on her shoulder. Its sapphire eyes, a perfect match for the goddess's own, staring intelligently at the temple's entrance. Next, she focused on the aegis. The golden, screaming face of the Gorgon began to shift. The rage drained from its features. The bestial snarl softened. The mouth closed, the lips settling into a line of sorrowful dignity. The mass of writhing snakes calmed, weaving themselves into a crown of terrible beauty. And from the Gorgon's closed golden eyes, a single tear of molten silver welled up and traced a path down the golden cheek, where it hardened into a permanent, gleaming teardrop. From behind the pillar, a young acolyte, a girl named Ilara, no older than 15, watched with a hand clamped over her mouth, her eyes wide with an emotion that transcended fear and bordered on religious ecstasy. She had been hiding, preparing the evening incense, when the doors had groaned open. She had expected a mob, soldiers, anything but this. She was watching a myth being unwritten. Finally, Medusa looked at the statue's face. The serene, ivory mask. She could not turn it to stone. Ivory was already dead. But she could alter it. She focused on the cold, sapphire eyes. She did not change their substance, but their expression. Her eyes were on the girl, Ilara, but her senses were spread throughout the temple. She could feel the vibrations of the guards' panicked retreat down the marble steps, the collective gasp and murmur of the crowd in the agora, the distant, frantic footsteps of the priest. All of it was a symphony of fear, a satisfying and familiar music. But the girl before her was a discordant note. She was terrified, yes, her pulse was a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. But there was something else in her gaze, awe, recognition. "You do not run," Medusa stated. It was not a question.
Ilara flinched at the sound of her voice, a low resonance that seemed to emanate from the marble itself. She swallowed, her throat clicking. "To where, goddess?" she whispered, her voice a reedy thread in the vast silence. "Running from a god is pointless. My mother taught me that. And running from the truth is a sin." The word truth hung in the incense-laden air. Medusa took a step closer. The girl held her ground, though her trembling intensified. "And what truth do you see here, little acolyte?" Ilara's gaze darted from Medusa's face to the transformed statue. She saw the weeping Gorgon on the aegis, the serpent of wisdom replacing the spear of war, the profound sorrow in the ivory goddess's sapphire eyes. "I see a story that was told wrong," Ilara stammered, her words gaining a sliver of confidence as she gave voice to the revelation. "I see the grief of the accused, not the pride of the victor. I see a temple that has been blind, and a goddess who has finally opened its eyes." A long, still moment passed. Medusa had expected screams, pleas, defiance. She had not expected exegesis. This mortal child had looked upon the rewritten myth and had, in an instant, understood its grammar. A faint, unfamiliar sensation stirred within Medusa, something that was not rage, nor vengeance, nor the cold satisfaction of power. It was curiosity. "You served her," Medusa said, gesturing with her chin towards the sorrowful colossus. "You lit her incense. You swept her floors. You polished the altar stained with the blood of her sacrifices. Do you feel no loyalty to your fallen master?" "Athena is the goddess of wisdom," Ilara said, her voice surprisingly steady. "If she is truly wise, she must be capable of regret. You have not destroyed her. You have perfected her. You have made her true." She looked at Medusa then, her brown eyes wide and earnest. "My loyalty is to the truth of the gods. You are that truth." Medusa considered the girl. A tool, a voice, a pair of hands in a world she no longer understood. A single devout follower could be more potent than 1,000 terrified subjects. Terror made men build walls. Belief made them open gates. "What is your name?" "Ilara, goddess." "Ilara," Medusa repeated, testing the shape of the word. "The world is new to me. I have slept for 3,000 years. I require a catechism. You will teach me the shape of this city, its rulers, its armies, its secrets. You will be my eyes and my ears within the walls of Argos. In return," Medusa paused. What could she offer? Wealth was meaningless. Power was a burden. In return, you will have a place at the heart of the coming storm. You will witness the unmaking of a world of lies. Ilara's breath hitched. She dropped to her knees, bowing her head so her forehead touched the cold marble floor. It was an act of pure, uncoerced devotion. "I am your servant, goddess. I will not fail you." "See that you do not," Medusa said, the chill returning to her voice. She turned away from the prostrate girl and walked towards the statue's dais. A profound weariness was settling deep in her bones. Not the simple fatigue of muscle, but a geologic ache, a hollowness at the core of her being. Rewriting the very substance of Athena's effigy had cost her more than she anticipated. The power of Nemesis was a deep well, but it was not infinite. She was a conduit, and the channeling left her scoured and thin. She needed to rest, to let the power well up within her once more. She sat upon the steps of the dais, directly at the feet of the weeping Athena, a daughter returned to the house of her cruel mother. She did not look at Ilara. "Speak," she commanded, her voice softer now, laced with that deep fatigue. "Tell me of the Archons. Tell me of the men the frightened priest has run to." and as the city of Argos began to seethe with panic, the new goddess of the temple sat in the shadows and listened to the whispers of her first priestess. The Archon's hall was a place of stern, masculine order. The walls were paneled with dark, polished cypress wood, the air smelling of beeswax and old papyrus. Maps of the Argolis and the Greater Peloponnese hung beside lists of shipping tariffs and military rosters. Here, the chaotic passions of the gods and the hysterics of the agora were meant to be distilled into cold, hard policy. Orpheon's arrival shattered that decorum. He burst through the chamber doors, his white robes disheveled, his face slick with sweat. The 5 archons of Argos, seated around a heavy oak table, looked up in startled annoyance. "She has taken the temple!" the high priest shrieked, his voice thin with panic. "A demon in the form of a woman! She turned the sacred symbol on my breast to stone! She melted the guard spears! She has defiled the statue of the goddess!" Cleon, the chief archon, a portly man whose power came from his family's control of the city's olive oil trade, slammed his hand on the table. "Guards, seize this madman! The high priest is unwell!" "I am not mad," Orpheon raved, pointing a trembling finger back towards the door. "Go to the agora, see for yourselves. She calls herself Medusa." The name fell into the chamber like a shard of ice. The archons froze. It was a name from myth, a nursery bogeyman. To hear it spoken as a present and active threat was so absurd it was terrifying. Only one man at the table remained perfectly still. He was Praxos, the eldest of the Archons, a man whose tenure had outlasted 2 generations of his colleagues. His face was a landscape of deep-cut lines, his beard the color of ash, his eyes holding the weary, pragmatic calm of a man who had seen plagues, earthquakes, and the Spartan army at the gates. "Orpheon," Praxos said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that cut through the priest's hysteria. "Be silent. Sit. Drink some water." He gestured to an attendant, who quickly complied. "Now," he continued, his gaze sweeping over his agitated colleagues, "let us behave like rulers of a great city, and not like startled goats. Let us assume for a moment the priest is not mad, but is merely reporting the impossible. What are the facts?" Orpheon, gulping the water, began to recount the events, his narrative still colored by terror, but now tethered by Praxos's calm. He described the sailors, the stone hand, the challenge, the transformation of his owl emblem, the melting of the spears, and the desecration of the temple. Demetrius felt the weight of Praxos's command settle on him like a burial shroud. It was a perfectly calculated political move, as brilliant as it was cruel. If he refused, he was a coward. If he went and failed, he was a fool who had overestimated his own importance. If, by some impossible chance, he succeeded, the credit would go to Praxos's cunning strategy. He was a pawn, and he knew it. But the eyes of the other archons, and soon the entire city, were upon him. Pride, that most Argive of vices, left him no choice but to play the part he had been assigned. He did not rush. He returned to his villa, bathed, and donned his finest robes of Tyrian purple, the color of magistrates. He fastened a short, ceremonial sword to his belt, not as a weapon against her, but as a symbol of his office, a reminder to himself that he was not some common petitioner, but a ruler of Argos. Every action was a deliberate performance, a construction of a confidence he did not feel. His hands, as he clasped a golden brooch at his shoulder, trembled ever so slightly. His walk to the agora was a trial.
The news had spread with the speed of a plague. The square, once a place of commerce and conversation, was now a vast, silent amphitheater of dread. Thousands of citizens were gathered, kept at a respectful distance from the temple steps by a hastily assembled line of city guards, who looked less like a containing force and more like the first row of spectators at a sacrifice. The crowd was not loud or riotous. A profound, unnatural stillness had fallen over them. It was the silence of a people who had just been told their gods were either dead or false. They watched Demetrius approach, their faces a mixture of hope and pity. He was their champion, their offering. He felt the weight of 1,000 silent prayers press down on his shoulders, and it was heavier than any armor. He walked with his back straight, his chin high, his gaze fixed on the shadowed portico of the temple, refusing to acknowledge the sea of frightened eyes. The two disarmed guards still stood at their post, their faces pale and drawn. They did not challenge him, merely watched him pass with hollow eyes. As Demetrius crossed the threshold, the bright, noisy reality of Argos fell away, replaced by a cool, incense-heavy gloom. The change was so abrupt, it was like stepping from the world of the living into the anteroom of the underworld. His eyes took a moment to adjust, and then he saw it, the statue. He had grown up in its shadow, had laid his first offering at its feet as a boy, had sworn oaths to it when he took his office. Seeing it now was a physical blow. The sorrow in the sapphire eyes was not just an alteration, it was an accusation that seemed to pierce him directly. The weeping Gorgon on the aegis was a sculpture of such profound grief that he had to force himself to look away. And the serpent, the great golden serpent coiled where the spear should be, seemed to watch him, its jewel eyes glinting in the dim light. It felt alive. Medusa sat on the dais at the statue's feet, as still as the marble around her. She was not looking at him. Her gaze was directed towards the young acolyte, Alara, who knelt before her, speaking in a low, earnest voice, recounting the lineages of the Archon families. And the House of Cleon has held the olive trade for 7 generations, their wealth built on a contract first granted by a decree of the priests of Hera. They are merchants who believe themselves kings, Medusa interrupted, her voice calm and resonant. She had not yet turned her head, yet her words were aimed directly at Demetrios. And you are from the house of Iphitos, are you not? A line that claims descent from a cousin of Heracles. You believe you have the blood of heroes in your veins. Demetrios froze, his carefully prepared opening speech turning to ash in his mouth. She knew who he was. The knowledge was a weapon, and she had just unsheathed it. I am Demetrios, Archon of Argos, he said. I have come on behalf of the people and the rulers of this city. Medusa finally turned her head. Her green eyes met his, and he felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if she were looking down into a well of infinite depth and coldness. There was no rage in them, no monstrous fire. There was only a terrifying, geologic patience. You have come on behalf of frightened men who hide behind titles, she corrected him.
You come from a man named Praxos, who offered you as a sacrifice to gauge the temperature of the water. Do not pretend you are here as an equal. You are a message, a test. So, deliver your message. The acolyte, Alara, rose and stood silently by the dais, her gaze proprietary and stern, as if he were an unwelcome intruder in her private audience. The sight of a familiar Argive girl so completely in the thrall of this being was, in its own way, as unsettling as the melted spears. Demetrios cleared his throat, forcing himself to recall his purpose. We, the city of Argos, wish to know your intentions, your demands.
This is a city of laws and gods. Your occupation of this sacred temple is an act of profound blasphemy and a disruption to the civil order. If there is a grievance, let it be known. If there is a price for your departure, let it be named." Medusa's lips formed her smile, a chilling curve that held no joy. "A price?" She savored the word. "You speak like the merchants who rule you. You believe everything can be bought and sold. Justice, power, history. But I am not a trader, Archon. I am a creditor. And this city has a debt that is 3 millennia overdue." She rose to her feet in a single fluid motion. She was taller than he had expected, her presence filling the vast space. "You speak of blasphemy. This temple was founded on it. It was built to honor the hero who murdered me and the goddess who orchestrated my ruin. It is a monument to a lie. My intention is to tear that lie down, stone by stone, until nothing remains but the truth." "The truth?" Demetrios challenged, finding a spark of his old fire. "The truth is that Perseus saved this world from a monster." "The truth," Medusa countered, taking a step down from the dais, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "is that a boy with a borrowed sword and a mirrored shield butchered a terrified, cursed girl in a cave, and then built a kingdom on the fame of his cowardice. He founded your city's greatness. His blood runs in your oldest families. His story is the seed from which Argos grew, and the seed is poison." She was closer now. He could see the impossible color of her eyes, the flawless texture of her skin. He did not feel fear of petrification. He felt a more profound dread, the fear of a man whose entire reality was being systematically dismantled by a superior intellect. "So, you wish to know my demands?" she continued, circling him slowly, like a shark inspecting its prey. "They are simple. I do not want your gold. I do not want your apologies. I want your history. I want you to erase the lie." She stopped directly in front of him. "On your Acropolis, there is a shrine. Within it, they say, is the shield of Perseus, the one polished to a mirror's sheen, a gift from Athena. The weapon that allowed a killer to look at his victim without meeting her eyes." Demetrios's blood ran cold. The shield of the founder was the city's most sacred relic. "You will go back to your fellow Archon," Medusa commanded. "You will tell them they have until the next full moon. They are to publicly dismantle that shrine. They are to take the shield, carry it to the highest cliffs overlooking the sea, and cast it into the depths from whence its master's patron came. They will then issue a new decree, to be carved in stone in the agora, stating that Perseus was not a hero, but a perjurer and a murderer, and that his name is to be struck from the rolls of honor for all time." It was an impossible demand. It was not a negotiation. It was an order for unconditional cultural suicide. That is impossible," Demetrios stammered. "The people would never stand for it. It would mean the end of Argos as we know it." "Yes," Medusa said, her eyes gleaming with cold fire. She leaned closer, her voice dropping so low only he could hear it. "And if you refuse, tell Praxos this. I will not turn your people to stone. That is too quick, too merciful. Instead, I will walk from this temple to the great cisterns that feed your city, and I will turn the water to dust. I will not kill your city, Archon. I will let it die.
Demetrios stumbled out into the blinding sunlight of the agora, his legs unsteady, the purple of his robes feeling garishly optimistic against the gray dread that had settled in his heart. The crowd saw his face, the color of bleached bone, his eyes wide with a horror that was no longer theatrical, and a collective groan of despair rippled through them. He gave them no answers, shouldering his way through the throng like a sleepwalker, his mind a chaotic whirl of dust, thirst, and the chilling finality in a goddess's eyes. His return to the Archon's hall was that of a ghost. He didn't speak at first, merely collapsing into his chair and staring at the grain of the oak table, as if it held the secrets of the universe. The other 4 men watched him, their own anxieties a palpable force in the stuffy room. "Well?" Cleon demanded, his voice tight with impatience. "What does the monster want? Gold? Sacrifices? Name the price and we shall pay it." Demetrios slowly lifted his head. He looked at Cleon with eyes that had aged a decade in the past hour. "She is not a monster," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "And you cannot buy the wind, Cleon. You cannot bargain with an earthquake. She does not want our wealth." "What then, in Hades' name?" Orpheon cried, wringing his hands. "She wants our soul," Demetrios whispered. He then recounted her demand, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, like a clerk reading a death sentence. He told them about the shield, the decree to denounce Perseus, and the impossible deadline of the full moon. As he finished, a tomb-like silence descended upon the chamber. Cleon was the first to break it, with a short, incredulous laugh. "She's mad, utterly mad. Strike the name of the founder? Cast away the sacred shield? The city would tear itself apart before it allowed such a thing. It's the bedrock of our legitimacy, our history." "It is a bluff," another Archon, a thin, nervous man named Lycomedes, offered weakly. "She cannot truly turn the city's water to dust." Demetrios looked at him. "She turned the symbol of Athena to stone from 30 paces, Lycomedes. She turned bronze to lead with a glance. Do you truly wish to wager the lives of every man, woman, and child in Argos on the hope that she is bluffing about the water?" The argument devolved into a cacophony of fear and fury. Cleon argued for offering tribute, a mountain of gold to be piled before the temple. Orpheon called for a citywide fast and a desperate appeal to Zeus and Hera, the patrons of Argos. Demetrios, his pride shattered, sat in sullen silence, convinced of their doom. Only Praxos remained quiet, his steepled fingers hiding his mouth, his old, hooded eyes watching the chaos with the detached interest of a physician observing the stages of a fever. Finally, he rapped his knuckles on the table, a sound as sharp and final as a snapping bone. The room fell silent. "You are all fools," he said, his voice a low gravel. "You flail like netted fish. Cleon, you cannot bribe a creed. Orpheon, you cannot pray away a god who has already defeated yours in her own house. And Demetrios, you have allowed her terror to unman you." He rose and began to pace, his steps slow and measured. "She is not a force of nature. She is a being with a history, with a grievance. She uses power, and the use of power requires energy. It has limits, and her greatest weapon is not petrification. It is her story." He stopped and looked at each of them in turn. Her story is that she is an avenging goddess of truth. Perseus's story is that he was a hero who slew a monster. For 3,000 years, his story has been stronger. Now, hers is. We are not fighting a woman. We are fighting a narrative. We cannot meet it with bronze spears or sacks of gold. We must meet it with a better story. "What better story is there?" Praxos scoffed. "One where we all die honorably for a lie?"
No, Praxos said, a glint in his ancient eyes. A truer one. She has positioned herself as the sole victim, the ultimate truth. But no story is that simple. She was one of three Gorgon sisters, Steno, Uriel, and Medusa, the mortal one. He leaned on the table, his voice dropping conspiratorially. The other two were immortal, deathless. Where are they now? Do they not grieve their slain sister? Do they not hold a grudge against the world that celebrated her murder? A new kind of silence filled the room, one of dawning, terrible comprehension.
You cannot mean to summon more of them? Orpheon whispered, horrified. I mean to find them, Praxis corrected. I mean to learn their story. Perhaps their narrative is not the same as hers. Perhaps they see her not as a martyred sister, but as a foolish one who entangled herself with the gods and paid the price. Perhaps they have no love for the world of mortals and would see her power as a threat to their own seclusion. An enemy of my enemy is a weapon. He straightened up, his decision made. She has given us until the full moon. That is not just a deadline, it is time. Time for us to act. Cleon, you will quietly begin rationing the city's water reserves. Do it under the guise of a seasonal shortage. We must prepare for her threat to be real. Demetrios, you will spread rumors, not of her demands, but of her weakness. Whisper that the Archon saw her tremble, that her power leaves her faint. We must chip away at the legend of her invincibility. Orpheon, you will go to the archives. I want every text, every scroll, every faded fragment that mentions the Gorgons. Not the heroic poems, the obscure texts, the naturalist catalogues, the forbidden histories. I want to know where they lived, what they ate, how they thought. And you, Praxos? Demetrius asked, a flicker of his old self returning. I, the old man said, am going to visit a man who knows that the dust in old libraries is more dangerous than any army. Inside the temple, the world of Argos had faded to a distant hum. Medusa sat not on the dais now, but on a simple wooden stool Alara had brought her from the acolyte's chambers. The girl knelt at her feet, carefully grinding a mixture of dried herbs in a small stone bowl. The scent of chamomile and lavender was a strange, gentle intrusion into the sacred, heavy air. This is a tisane, goddess, Alara explained, her focus entirely on her task, for calming the spirit. The priestesses of Hera drink it to aid in their visions. I have no need of visions, child, Medusa said, her voice softer than it had been in the agora, yet still laced with an infinite weariness. The reshaping of the statue, followed by the focused projection of her will upon Demetrius, had left her feeling hollowed out, as if her very essence had been abraded. My memories are vivid enough. It is not for visions, Alara insisted gently, not looking up. It is for rest. You are a vessel for a great power, but even the strongest amphora can crack if it is never allowed to be still. Medusa watched the girl's nimble fingers. Ilara's devotion was absolute, yet it was not mindless. It was practical, observant. She had seen the faint tremor in Medusa's hand after the Archon had left, had noted the way her voice lost its resonant edge when she was tired. She was not just a worshipper, she was a caretaker. You have served gods before, Medusa observed. You see them not as abstract concepts, but as beings with needs. All things have needs, goddess, Alara replied, pouring hot water from a small brazier into the bowl. The fragrant steam rose between them. The gods need belief. Mortals need water. The earth needs the rain. It is the great chain. You have been alone for so long. Perhaps you have forgotten that you are a part of it, too. The simple wisdom of it silenced Medusa. For millennia, she had been a thing apart, a cursed priestess, a monster in a cave, a dead legend. Now she was a goddess walking the earth.
Yet this mortal girl was reminding her of a fundamental truth she had shed along with her humanity. The thought was unsettling. A noise from the temple entrance drew their attention. A citizen, a weaver by the look of his stained hands, had crept up the step.
Not the legends. The truth. Theron the scribe looked up from a tablet he was meticulously cleaning with a soft cloth. His eyes, magnified by thick lenses of polished quartz that perched precariously on his nose, were rheumy and perpetually unimpressed. He surveyed Praxos, from his fine woolen robes to the faint scent of power that clung to him like a cheap perfume, and let out a dry, rustling sigh. "Truth," Theron rasped, his voice like the scrape of a stylus on slate. "An Archon comes to my door asking for truth? Has the world turned upside down? The truth, my Lord Praxos, is that you and your colleagues pay me to prune history, not to cultivate it. You want the glorious lies, the heroic genealogies that trace your muddy bloodlines back to some philandering god. The truth is a weed. It's ugly. It gets tangled in the foundations, and you have consistently paid me to poison it." Praxos did not flinch. He had known Theron for 30 years. "The weeds have overgrown the garden, old man. They have taken the temple. I have no time for your cynicism. I need to know about her sisters." The scribe's theatrical weariness evaporated, replaced by a sharp, sudden stillness. He took off his quartz lenses and polished them with a slow, deliberate motion. "Ah," he said softly, "so the monster has a family, and you wish to invite them to the feast. A bold strategy. Most men, when they find a viper in their bed, do not go looking for its nest. I need to know if they are a weapon or a greater threat," Praxos said, his voice low and urgent. "They are both," Theron replied without hesitation. He shuffled over to a towering, chaotic stack of scrolls in a corner, pulling at one near the bottom. The whole pile swayed ominously before settling. He blew a cloud of dust from the scroll's clay seal and cracked it open on his cluttered table. The papyrus was yellowed and fragile. The poets, like that fool Pindar, sing of the three Gorgons as a monolith, a trinity of terror. It's neat, it's dramatic, it is, of course, a lie. He ran a gnarled finger across a line of faded text. The primary sources, the ones that predate the Perseus myth-making industry, are fragmented. They speak of Steno, the mighty, and Uriel, the far-springer. They were born of Phorcys and Keto, primordial sea deities. They were creatures of scale and fang, and bronze hands from their first breath. They were not cursed, they were the curse. They were power, elemental and eternal. Immortal, Praxos affirmed. Deathless, Theron corrected, a crucial distinction in his voice. Things that are immortal can be constrained, imprisoned. Things that are deathless simply endure. They are geological facts, Praxos, like a mountain or the sea. You do not fight them. You learn to walk around them. He tapped the scroll again, and then there was the third, the afterthought, Medusa. He looked up at Praxos. She was not like them, born mortal, born beautiful by all accounts. She was the cuckoo in their nest of vipers. Can you imagine her childhood? Her sisters were unchanging, eternal forces of nature. She was soft, fragile, and bleeding. She would age, she would die. They must have looked upon her with a mixture of pity and contempt. She was their pet, their flaw. You think they would not seek to avenge her? Theron let out another dry chuckle.
Avenge her? Praxos, you think like a human. You think of family as bonds of love and loyalty. For beings like them, family is a cage of shared circumstance. Medusa's death was not a tragedy for them. It was a return to form. It restored the integrity of their design. They were two again, as they should have been. Her new life, her power, her presence. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. That is the true disruption. She has clawed her way back from mortality and stolen a god's power. She has made herself their equal. I assure you, they will not see that as a victory for the family. They will see it as an intolerable arrogance. A slow, grim satisfaction settled in Praxos's gut. He had been right. Where are they? Gone, Theron said simply. After Perseus desecrated their home, they vanished from the known world. The old texts hint at a place of self-exile, a place the deathless go when they tire of the fleeting world of men. He rolled up the scroll and moved towards a heavy, iron-bound chest in the darkest corner of the room. It was the only object in the house that was not covered in dust. He produced a large, ornate key from a chain around his neck. There are stories the Archons have forbidden me from cataloging in the public archive. Traders' maps marked with warnings, the ravings of shipwrecked sailors. They speak of an island, or a chain of islands, far to the west, beyond the Pillars of Heracles, a place shrouded in a perpetual, unnatural fog. They call it the Morning Archipelago. He unlocked the chest. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded linen, was a single, rolled chart of sea-stained parchment. Sailors who are blown off course and stray too close speak of a sound that carries across the water, a constant, high-pitched wail, like the sound of weeping. Praxos stared at the map. Weeping? Perhaps, Theron said, his expression unreadable as he handed the chart to the Archon. Or perhaps it is the sound of two deathless beings laughing at the folly of a world that thinks it has any power over them at all. The pile of offerings grew. What began as a trickle of fear became a steady stream. There were loaves of bread, flagons of wine, clay dolls, bolts of fine cloth, and even a live goat, tethered to a pillar by a trembling farmer who then fled without looking back. Ilara, with a priestess's innate sense for order, had begun to organize the tribute. The perishables were stored in a cool side chamber. The valuables were arranged neatly on a vacant altar. The goat, she decided, would be her personal responsibility. Medusa watched this domesticity with a detached, analytical coldness. It was all meaningless. The offerings were not worship. They were insurance payments against disaster. Yet she could not deny the efficiency of her new acolyte. The temple, under Ilara's care, was beginning to feel less like a conquered fortress and more like a functioning seat of power. "You should eat, goddess," Ilara said, approaching her with a piece of bread and a cluster of grapes laid on a clean dish. "I have no need for food," Medusa replied, her gaze fixed on the sorrowful face of the Athena statue. "Perhaps not," Ilara said, undeterred. She placed the dish on the small table beside Medusa's stool. "But your body is new. It is still learning the ways of the world. It needs anchors, food, rest. These are the anchors that keep the soul from drifting." Medusa turned to look at her. "You speak with the confidence of a philosopher, little priestess. Where did you learn such things?" "From my grandmother," Ilara said with a small smile. "She was a midwife. She knew that the greatest of spirits are still bound by the simplest of threads. She would have liked you, I think. She always said the world was broken and that only a woman with eyes of stone could ever fix it. The casual, folksy prophecy struck Medusa with an unexpected force. She looked away, towards the temple doors. Your city is beginning to stir. They are whispering. What do they whisper, goddess? That I am weak, that my power is a fading echo. The Archon Demetrios has a loose tongue. A flicker of true anger, hot and sharp, pierced through her weariness. They seek to erode my terror. They think that if they can make me seem small, they can defeat me. It is what frightened men do, Ilara said calmly. They cannot fight the mountain, so they tell stories of how it is merely a pile of loose gravel. Will you show them their error? Medusa considered it. A display of power. Turn the fountain in the agora to salt. Wither the olive trees on Cleon's estate. It would be easy, but it would also be a reaction. It would be an answer to their provocation, placing her on their level. Praxos. This had the feel of the old man, of his patient, corrosive cunning. No, Medusa decided. Let them whisper. Let them build their little sandcastles of hope. The tide will come when it comes. Their fear will be all the greater when they realize their whispers were meaningless. She picked up a single grape from the plate. It was cool and firm against her fingertips. She put it in her mouth. The burst of sweetness was a shock, a forgotten sensation from a life that was not hers. It was an anchor. Ilara was right. Goddess? Ilara asked, her voice hesitant. The old stories, the ones the Archons would have us forget, they say you were not alone on your island. Medusa's hand froze on its way to another grape. The air in the temple grew colder.
The old stories say many things. They say you had sisters, Ilara pressed gently. Steno and Euryale, are they like you? Will they come to your aid? Medusa placed the grape back on the plate. The memory of her sisters was not a comfort. It was a landscape of sharp rocks. They were the cage of her childhood, their casual cruelty and eternal nature, a constant reminder of her own fragile mortality. They had not loved her. They had owned her. They had watched Poseidon's crime with the same detached curiosity with which they watched a spider trap a fly. Her curse had made her monstrous, yes, but it had also made her their equal in power. It was the only thing that had ever earned her. The port of Argos was another city entirely, one that smelled not of incense and power, but of salt, pitch, and fermenting fish. By night, it was a labyrinth of shadowed wharves and swaying masts, its darkness punctuated by the oily orange glow of lanterns outside taverns from which spilled the raucous sounds of dice and desperation. Praxos, wrapped in a heavy, dark cloak that hid his patrician robes, moved through this world with the silent purpose of a predator. He was not a welcome presence here, and he knew it. The port was a place of pragmatic men who respected strength and gold and had little time for the high-minded politics of the Acropolis. He found his quarry on the deck of a lean, scarred trading vessel named the Sea Serpent. Its hull was patched, its sail mended, but it had the look of a ship that had outrun storms and pirates alike. Lycastus, its captain, was a man carved from the same salt-bleached timber as his ship. He was broad-shouldered and bare-armed, his skin a tapestry of faded tattoos and sun-cured wrinkles. He was coiling a thick rope with an economy of motion that spoke of 1,000 such nights. He did not look up as Praxos stopped at the gangplank. The docks are closed to your kind after dark, Archon, Lycastus said, his voice a low rasp, like ropes straining against a capstan. The rats come out at night, both the four-legged and the two-legged kind. And which kind are you, Captain? Praxos asked, his tone even. Lycastus finally looked up. His eyes were a startlingly pale gray, the color of a winter sea. The kind that survives. He finished coiling the rope and straightened up. What does the great Praxos want with a humble sailor who may or may not be carrying untaxed wine from Naxos? I have a voyage for you, Praxos said, ignoring the jibe. A charter, one that will fill your hold with more gold than 10 trips to Naxos. Lycastus laughed, a short, humorless bark. I've heard that promise before. It usually ends with a ship on the rocks or a crew in chains. I'm not a fool, old man. This voyage is not for fools, Praxos conceded. It is for the best pilot in Argos, a man who, they say, once navigated the clashing rocks in a gale because he was late for a rendezvous with a merchant's wife. A flicker of pride touched the captain's stony face. The poets exaggerate. It was only a squall. What's the cargo? None, and there is no destination port. Praxos held up the sea-stained chart he'd gotten from Theron. I need you to sail to a place that is not on any known map. Lycastus stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the parchment in the dim lantern light. He saw the strange markings, the warnings of unnatural fog, the name that was more a description than a place, the Morning Archipelago. His weathered face, which had seemed incapable of surprise, tightened. Beyond the pillars of Heracles, he breathed, a note of disbelief in his voice. Into the outer sea? You're not just mad, Archon. You're suicidal. No ship returns from there. That is the edge of the world, where the ocean spills into nothingness. That is the story told to children, Praxos countered smoothly. You and I know the world is not a plate. It is merely vast and dangerous. I need a man who is not afraid of stories. He unfastened a heavy purse from his belt. The clink of the coins was loud in the sudden quiet. Half of this now, for you and a hand-picked crew who can keep their mouths shut. The other half upon your return. A silent crew, a fast ship, and your nerve, Captain. That is all I ask. Lycastus stared at the purse, then back at the map. The gold was a lure, but the map was the true hook. It was a challenge to everything he knew, an insult to his mastery of the sea. To sail to a place that shouldn't exist, it was the ultimate test. His greed warred with his survival instinct, but it was his pride that made the final decision. I will need provisions for 3 months, he said, his voice low, and I will not sail on any man's authority but my own. Your gold buys my ship, Archon, not my obedience. If I say we turn back, we turn back. Agreed, Praxos said instantly. Leave on the morning tide under the cover of the fishing fleet. No flags, no fanfare. Vanish. Lycastus took the purse, its weight a solid, reassuring fact in a conversation of myths and madness. And the purpose of this suicide run? What am I looking for in this land of fog and weeping? Praxos's eyes were dark pools of shadow. You are looking for 2 women, sisters. You will know them when you see them. You are not to engage them. You are not to speak to them. You are to confirm they are there, and it was warm. Not just warm, but pulsing with a faint, sluggish heat, like a feverish animal.
The dark, thread-like veins multiplied before his eyes, a web of black corruption spreading through the pale stone. The marble itself seemed to be losing its hard, crystalline structure, softening, taking on a waxy, translucent quality. The noble features of his ancestor began to sag, the stern mouth pulling down into a grimace of agony, the once proud eyes sinking into their sockets as if the very stone were decaying from within. A smell, faint at first, then rising in a sickening plume, filled the atrium. It was the smell of a long-sealed tomb, of stagnant water and rot, of flesh that had forgotten the sun. Demetrios scrambled backwards, his wine goblet slipping from his numb fingers and clattering on the mosaic floor. "No," he whimpered, a sound of pure denial. "No, no." One of his household slaves, a young Thracian girl, came running at the sound of the crash. She stopped dead in the entryway, her eyes wide, a hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. She too could see it, could smell it. This was no trick of the light, no figment of a guilty conscience. Demetrios's terror curdled into a hot, desperate rage. This was an assault, a violation of his home, his bloodline, his very identity. He would not be unmanned by a witch's trick. He seized a heavy bronze brazier from its stand, its legs scraping loudly against the floor. With a roar of fury, he swung it with all his might, crashing it into the side of the liquefying bust. The sound was not the sharp, satisfying crack of shattering stone. It was a wet, heavy thud, like striking a side of spoiled meat. The bust did not break, it tore. A great chunk of it slumped to the floor, leaving a gaping, fibrous wound in the neck. From the wound, there was no blood, but a slow, thick trickle of gray, gritty dust, like powdered bone. The severed piece lay on the floor, no longer resembling marble, but a lump of putrid, gray flesh. And before their horrified eyes, it seemed to sag further, collapsing in on itself in a final act of grotesque decay. The Thracian girl finally screamed, a raw, piercing shriek that echoed through the villa. Demetrios dropped the brazier and stumbled back against a pillar, his breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. His pride, his ancestry, his name. She had reached into the heart of his home and turned it all to rot. The whispers of her weakness were a lie. This was not the act of a fading power. This was the act of a god with a surgeon's cruelty and an eternity of hate. Weeks bled into one another on the open, indifferent expanse of the outer sea. Lycastus and the sea serpent had long since left the familiar world behind. They sailed under alien constellations, through waters of a strange, deep indigo. The sun seemed harsher here, the moon colder. The crew of 20, hand-picked for their skill and their silence, had grown more silent still. They worked the lines, mended the sails, and took their watches with a grim efficiency. But the easy camaraderie of the Argos docks was gone, replaced by a shared, unspoken dread. Lycastus felt it too, a cold knot in his gut that had nothing to do with the sea's motion. He was a man of charts and winds, of observable facts, but here the facts were changing. One afternoon, a week past the Pillars of Hercules, the sea had gone unnaturally still, the surface as smooth and gray as polished slate. The air grew cold, and the lookout had cried out, pointing to the horizon. It was not land, it was a wall, a bank of fog, dense and motionless, stretching from north to south as far as the eye could see. It did not drift or swirl like sea fog. It stood, patient and absolute, like a cliffside. "That is not natural," his first mate, a grizzled Cretan named Nereus, muttered, making a sign with his thumb and forefinger to ward off evil. "It is a shroud. The world ends there, Captain." "The world ends where our courage does, Nereus," Lycastus had snapped, his voice sharper than he intended. He stared at the chart Theron had given him. The fog bank was marked on it with a wavy, uncertain line. The morning archipelago lay within, or beyond. I was a man who had accepted a contract, and the pride that had accepted it would not allow him to turn back now. We shorten sail and proceed with caution. Post lookouts on the bow and stern. I want every man with a rope or an oar in his hand. Entering the fog was like being swallowed. The transition was instant. One moment they were under a cold, clear sky. The next, they were in a blind, gray world. Visibility dropped to the length of the ship. The air became thick, damp, and chillingly cold, clinging to the skin like a wet burial shroud. The most unsettling part was the silence. The normal sounds of the sea, the cry of gulls, the slap of waves against the hull, the sigh of the wind in the rigging, vanished. The fog seemed to eat sound, leaving only the creak of their own timbers and the frantic beating of their own hearts. They were sailing through a silent, weightless limbo. For 2 days they drifted, navigating by compass and instinct. The crew's nerves were stretched to the breaking point. Men started at shadows, whispered that they heard voices in the silence, that they saw shapes moving just at the edge of sight. Lycastus pushed them on, his face a mask of grim determination, though he spent his nights staring into the impenetrable gray, feeling the oppressive weight of this unnatural sea, and wondering if Praxos's gold would be enough to pay for his soul. On the morning of the 3rd day, a new sound began to intrude upon the silence. It was faint at first, a high, thin note that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was not the wind. It grew steadily in volume, a sustained, piercing wail that vibrated in the teeth and settled deep in the bones. It was a sound of absolute, unending grief. Weeping. "Captain!" the lookout shrieked, his voice cracking with terror. "Land! Dead ahead!" Through a momentary thinning of the fog, Lycastus saw it. A spire of black, jagged rock, slick with moisture, rising from the gray water like a broken tooth. Then another, and another. They had reached the archipelago. And as the sea serpent navigated the treacherous new channel, the weeping grew louder, an inescapable symphony of sorrow welcoming them to the islands of the lost. The story of Demetrios's desecrated bust spread through Argos not like a whisper, but like a contagion. The Thracian slave had told the other slaves, who told the market vendors, who told their customers. The tale grew more grotesque with each telling. It wasn't just a bust, it was the man's entire shrine. It hadn't just rotted, it had screamed. It hadn't bled dust, it had bled black, choking smoke. Praxos's carefully constructed narrative of a weak, fading entity was shattered. Medusa was not weak. She was vengeful, her power was intimate, and she could reach into any home she chose. The city's brief flicker of defiance was extinguished, replaced by a cowering, paranoid terror. Offerings at the temple, which had dwindled, now returned with a desperate fervor. In the Archon's hall, the mood was funereal. Demetrios was absent, having locked himself in his villa, refusing to see anyone. Cleon paced the room, his face pale and sweaty.
"This is a disaster," he hissed, rounding on Praxos. "Your plan has backfired spectacularly. You prodded the serpent, and it bit one of us. People are terrified. The grain merchants are talking about fleeing the city. This thing in the temple is picking us off one by one, starting with the man you sent to her." "She did not kill him," Praxos stated, his voice a cold anchor in the storm of panic. "She did not harm his family or his wealth. She destroyed a piece of stone, a symbol. She is still speaking a language, Cleon, not just screaming. She is telling us that our history, our pride, is a disease. She is a physician applying a poultice of terror." "A physician who kills the patient," Cleon shot back. "Demetrius is not the patient. Argos is," Praxos said, his gaze hard. "And she has given us her diagnosis. Now we must find our own cure." He looked around the table, his eyes lingering on the empty chair. Her power has limits. This was a precise and difficult act, performed from a distance. It must have cost her. She is not an infinite well of power. She is a woman who has seized a lightning bolt, and she cannot hold it forever. He felt a weariness deep in his bones. The waiting was the hardest part. Waiting for Lycastus. Waiting for the full moon, now only 4 days away.
But the hands were a lie. They looked like they belonged to a woman, but they were the instruments of a goddess, and they remembered the feel of unmaking stone from half a city away. The memory did not feel like triumph. It felt like an echo of an older, more terrible transformation, a memory of her own flesh twisting, her hair thickening and quickening into venomous life. The power was a part of her, but it was not her. It was a weapon she had picked up, and it was still slick with the blood of its previous owner. The exhaustion, when it finally claimed her, was absolute. It was not the simple weariness of a mortal body, but a profound ontological fatigue. She did not fall asleep on her stool so much as she was pulled under, the incense-scented air of the temple dissolving into the cold, damp salt stench of a cave. She was small again. Her hair was black and soft, falling over her shoulders. Her hands were her own, but they were trembling. She was watching them, Steno and Euryale, by the light of a fire that gave no warmth. They were playing a game with the bones of a sea lion, tossing them like dice. Steno, broad and powerful, her bronze claws clicking on the stone, her laughter a grating, metallic sound. Euryale, lithe and cruel, her long tail coiled around her ankles, her smile revealing teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. "The little mortal is shivering," Euryale's thoughts slithered into her mind. "Is the world too cold for you, little sister?" "She is weak," Steno's thought followed, blunt and heavy as a club. "She will break. All mortal things do." Medusa huddled deeper into her thin robe, her eyes fixed on the fire. She had long ago learned that meeting their gaze was unwise. They did not turn mortals to stone, but their deathless, predatory stare could strip the soul bare. "A ship passed today," Euryale mused, flicking a knucklebone across the floor. "So close. I could smell their sweat, the little squeaking sounds they make when they are afraid." "Let them pass," Steno rumbled. "They are not worth the effort. They are mayflies. They hatch, they buzz, they die. They are beneath our notice." "But she is not." Euryale's thought was a sharp, probing thing directed at Medusa. "She is one of them, a mayfly in our nest. I wonder what sound she would make." Medusa felt a cold dread clamp around her heart. She squeezed her eyes shut, but it did no good. In the darkness, she saw herself through their eyes, a fragile, temporary thing, a pet, a toy, an aberration. Her beauty, which the world of men was beginning to notice on her rare, stolen trips to the shore, was a source of contempt for them. It was a sign of her fleeting, pathetic mortality. The memory shifted violently. The cave was the same, but the air was thick with the scent of brine and ozone, the scent of a god, Poseidon. She could feel the crushing weight of his presence, the heat of his gaze, and she could feel her sister's thoughts, not angry, not protective, but interested. They were watching. They were observing this new, fascinating event with the detached curiosity of naturalists studying an insect. They did not intervene. She was the mayfly, and this was merely a storm that had come to tear her wings. Medusa awoke with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs, the phantom scent of salt and divine arrogance filling her nostrils. She was in the temple. Ilara was standing over her, her face etched with concern, a heavy blanket in her hands. "Goddess?" the girl asked, her voice a soft whisper. "You were crying out." Medusa touched her own cheek. It was wet. She had not wept in 3,000 years, not as a monster, not as a myth. The sensation was terrifyingly human. She was a goddess of vengeance, a being of immense power. Yet here, in the dark, she was still the terrified girl in the cave. She pulled away from Ilara's offered comfort, the shame as sharp as a shard of glass. "It was nothing," she said, her voice strained, "a shadow of a memory." Ilara didn't press. She simply draped the blanket over Medusa's shoulders. The simple weight of it, the mundane warmth, was an anchor. "The shadows are long in this place," the acolyte said softly. "But you are the light now. You must not let them consume you." Medusa looked at the girl, at the pure, unwavering belief in her eyes. Ilara saw a goddess. She did not see the broken priestess, the cowering sister, the terrified victim. And in that moment, Medusa understood that Ilara's faith was not just a comfort, it was a shield. It was the story she needed to believe about herself. "No," Medusa said, her voice regaining its strength. "They will not." But as she looked towards the temple entrance, towards the city that feared her, she felt a new kind of cold. The memory of her sisters was not just a shadow, it was a premonition. The sea serpent crashed through the narrow channel between two black rock spires, the wailing sound now a deafening physical force. It seemed to emanate from the rock itself, from the gray, churning water. There was no soil on these islands, no green thing. It was a landscape of pure, dead stone, carved by an eternity of sorrowful wind. "It's not weeping!" Nereus yelled over the din, his face the color of old parchment. He was pointing, his hand shaking violently. "It's singing!" Lycostus followed his gaze. High on the tallest spire, a figure was perched, silhouetted against the thick gray fog. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but its posture was all wrong. Theron stared at the Archon, his rheumy eyes unblinking behind their quartz lenses. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint rustle of a mouse in a pile of papyrus. The scribe slowly, deliberately, reached for a clay cup of watered wine. "You want me to write a tragedy?" he rasped, his voice thin with a new kind of awe. "Not a decree, a tragedy. And you want to make her the protagonist?" I want to give her a past the city can understand, Praxos corrected, though it was a distinction without a difference. Her power comes from being an icon of absolute singular victimhood. We will complicate that. We will show them that she was born into a world of monsters, that her own family were the things of nightmare, that Perseus did not slay the first monster she ever faced, he merely slew the last. Theron let out a dry, rattling laugh that turned into a hacking cough. He wiped his mouth on his sleeve. By the gods, you are a crueler man than I ever imagined, Praxos. It's brilliant, utterly suicidally brilliant. He leaned forward, the cynical mask falling away to reveal the sharp, dangerous mind of a true historian. You are not trying to make them hate her. You are trying to pity her. Hate can be defied. Fear can be endured. But pity? Pity is a cage for the pitied. It diminishes. It softens. It makes the subject of it smaller. Precisely, Praxos said. And you think she will not see this for the attack it is? Theron scoffed. She will level the city for it. To have her agony repackaged as a public spectacle, to have her private history turned into a political tool, it is a violation far deeper than destroying a statue. Perhaps, Praxos conceded, but it will also be true. And the truth, even when weaponized, has a power all its own. She has built her new divinity on a foundation of her story. I intend to show her that the foundation is not as solid as she believes. I am giving her back a piece of her past that she has tried to forget. Let us see how she bears its weight. He pushed the blank scroll further across the table. Write it, Theron. Write it as if you were Aeschylus himself. Give me poetry that cuts like a knife. The full moon is in 3 days. The story must be told tomorrow. Theron picked up his stylus. He did not look at Praxos again. He looked into the shadows of his workshop, as if seeing the ghosts of the story he was about to conjure. You are not fighting a woman, he whispered, to himself as much to the Archon. You are fighting a narrative, and you are answering it with a poem. I pray for all our sakes, old man, that your words are stronger than her wrath. The next day, the city awoke to a strange sight. Not a show of force, not a new guard, but a stone carver working meticulously on a new slab of marble erected beside the one bearing Medusa's demands. By midday, a crowd had gathered in the agora, drawn by a mixture of morbid curiosity and dread. They kept their distance from the temple steps, but their eyes were fixed on the new proclamation. It was not a short, sharp decree. It was long, the text flowing down the marble in elegant, precise letters. An official herald, his face pale and his voice trembling slightly, stood before the carving and began to read. The crowd fell into a hushed, nervous silence. He did not speak of threats or defiance. He spoke of the primordial dark, of the sea gods Phorcus and Ceto, and of the monstrous children they birthed. He named them Steno, the mighty, a being of eternal rage, her flesh of living bronze. Euryale, the far-springer, a creature of cold hunger and reptilian speed. The herald's voice painted a picture of a lightless, joyless existence on a storm-racked island, a home that was a prison. Then his tone softened. He spoke of a third sister, an anomaly, Medusa, born mortal, born with soft skin and hair that caught the sunlight. He spoke of her as a songbird in a viper's nest, a warm flame in a world of geological told. The crowd shifted, murmuring. This was not the story they knew. This was not the snake-haired monster of legend. The herald's voice filled with pathos as he described her isolation, her sister's contempt for her fragility, their cruel amusement at her mortality. He told of her desperate search for a world beyond the rocks, of her devotion to a goddess who promised a life of light and order. He did not name Poseidon. He did not name Athena. He merely spoke of a god's lust and a goddess's jealousy, transforming the core of her trauma into an abstract, universal tragedy. The story artfully excised Perseus's heroism, recasting him not as a monster slayer, but as an ignorant executioner who arrived at the end of a long, sad tale and mistook the final victim for the villain. When the herald finished, silence hung over the agora. It was not the silence of terror that had gripped them before. It was a confused, contemplative silence. The image of Medusa had been split in two. There was the terrifying goddess on the hill, and now there was this other Medusa, the mortal girl, the abused sister, the tragic priestess. The narrative had fractured her, turning her from a monolith of terror into a subject of debate. Alara had listened from the edge of the crowd, her basket of market goods forgotten in her hand. Her heart ached with a fierce, protective sorrow. The story was a profanity, a public airing of her goddess's deepest wounds, yet it rang with a terrible truth. It explained the sadness she saw in Medusa's eyes when she thought no one was watching, the flinching from her own memories, the nightmare she had cried out from. These men, these cowardly Archons, had stumbled upon a truth they had no right to know, and they were wielding it like a club. Her face set with grim resolve, she turned and hurried back towards the temple. The goddess had to be warned. Medusa felt the shift in the city before Alara returned. It was a subtle change in the psychic atmosphere. The raw, high-pitched frequency of panic had modulated, becoming something lower, more complex. It was as if 1,000 people had all drawn a breath at the same time, and were now holding it. When Alara entered the temple, her face was a storm of conflicting emotions. She knelt, but her movements were agitated. "What is it?" Medusa asked, her voice calm. The exhaustion was still with her, a cold stone in her core, but the waiting had sharpened her senses. What has the old man done now? "They have written a new story, goddess," Alara said, her voice trembling with indignation. "They have carved it in the agora for all to see. It is about you, about your childhood, about them." She could not bring herself to say the names. Medusa's stillness became absolute. "Tell me." Alara recited what she had heard, her voice gaining strength as her anger grew. She recounted the tale of the monstrous sisters, of the mortal child, of the victimhood. She relayed it as an insult, a disgusting attempt to defang Medusa's righteous fury by cloaking it in pity. But Medusa was not listening to it as an insult. She was hearing the echoes of her own life, spoken in the public square. The cold cave, the scrape of bronze claws, the whispers of contempt for her soft, dying flesh, the endless, crushing weight of their deathless nature. Praxos, or his scribe, had guessed so much, too much. They had taken her most private, shameful wound, the truth that she had been a victim long before she was a legend, and held it up for the entire world to see. It was a masterful stroke, more brilliant and far more cruel than simply spreading rumors of weakness. The rumor was a lie she could disprove with a show of force. But this was a truth she had spent 3,000 years trying to burn out of her own memory. They had not attacked the goddess. They had resurrected the girl. A cold, sick feeling, one she hadn't felt since she'd last seen her own human reflection, coiled in her stomach. Her power was rooted in her rage, a pure, clean fire forged in the crucible of injustice. But this story, this wave of public pity, was like sand thrown into the fire, choking it, dirtying it. Her rage was being recontextualized as the lashing out of a broken thing. "Goddess," Alara whispered, seeing the look on her face. It was not the divine fury she expected. It was something closer to horror. "Shall I go and tell them that you reject their lies, that your sisters were your kin and you loved them?" Medusa looked at the earnest, devoted face of her acolyte, and a bitter, soundless laugh caught in her throat. Loved them? She had feared them. She had placated them. She had survived them. Love was a mortal word, and it had no place on that island. "No, child," Medusa said, her voice a dead whisper. She stood up from her stool and walked towards the statue of Athena, its stone face a mask of sorrow. She reached out and laid a hand on its cold cheek. "You cannot deny a story that is true." The terror she had so carefully cultivated was being transmuted into something else, something she could not fight. Praxos had not raised a shield against her. He had held up a mirror. And in it, he was forcing the entire city, and worse, forcing her to see the terrified, mortal girl cowering behind the goddess's eyes. The full moon was 2 days away. Her deadline felt less like a threat she was making, and more like a precipice she was being pushed towards. The coldness of the stone under her palm was no longer a comfort. It was a cage. She was a statue, just like Athena, trapped in a story someone else had carved. For 3,000 years, her narrative had been one of monstrous power, a myth so absolute it had calcified into fact. Now, Praxos had taken a chisel to it. He hadn't tried to shatter it. He had simply carved a new face on the other side, the face of a weeping girl. Ilara watched her, a silent, worried guardian. The girl had tried to speak twice, offering food, then a fresh infusion of herbs, but Medusa had silenced her with a look. The goddess's stillness was no longer regal. It was brittle, like a pane of ice on the verge of cracking. The air in the temple felt thin, the incense unable to mask the scent of old grief, sharp as ozone. The offerings that trickled in throughout the day were different. The fear was still there, but it was alloyed with something new, something worse. A woman left a single, perfect seashell, the kind a child might treasure. An old man, his face a mask of sorrow, placed a small linen-wrapped bundle on the altar. It held the tiny, worn sandals of a baby. They were no longer trying to appease a god of terror. They were leaving gifts at the tomb of a girl they thought they knew. Each offering was a grain of sand thrown in her eyes, a whisper of, "We understand you," that was more suffocating than any curse. Medusa turned from the statue. Her gaze fell on the baby's sandals. She felt a surge of revulsion so violent it was almost physical. They were mourning a version of her that she herself had spent millennia trying to kill. This public grief was an act of appropriation, a theft of her own pain. They did not have the right. "Take them away," she commanded, her voice raw. Ilara started. "Goddess?" "All of it." Medusa swept a hand towards the altar, her gesture sharp and dismissive.
The shell, the sandals, the pity. I will not have it. Burn it. But they are offerings, Ilara stammered, shocked by the vehemence in her tone. They are meant with a good heart. Their hearts are poison, Medusa snapped, turning on her. For the first time, Ilara saw not a goddess, but a raw, exposed nerve. They do not offer solace, they offer chains. They want to bind me in a narrative of weakness. They want me to be their tragic little songbird, broken and pitiable. A thing to be mourned and eventually forgotten. My rage is a sword, little priestess. Pity is the rust that will destroy it. She strode to the temple entrance, her bare feet silent on the marble. She looked down at the agora. The crowd was gone, but the newly carved stone stood like a gleaming white wound in the heart of her city. Her story, her tragedy, for public consumption. She could feel the city thinking about her, turning her over in their minds, dissecting her past. She had been a symbol of pure power. Now she was a subject for discussion. The demotion was intolerable. They will have their answer, she whispered, not to Ilara, but to the city itself. But it will not be the one they expect. The sea serpent limped into the port of Argos after midnight, a ghost ship slipping through the harbor fog. There were no lights on its deck, no calls from the crew. They moved like shades, securing the lines with trembling hands, their eyes wide and haunted, forever looking over their shoulders at the endless gray sea that had followed them home. They were not the same men who had left. The sea had leached the life from them, replacing it with a bone-deep dread. Praxos was waiting in the shadows of a pitch and timber warehouse, alone. Lycastus met him at the end of the wharf. The captain looked 10 years older. His sun-cured skin had a grayish pallor, and the steady nerve that had defined him was gone, replaced by a twitch in his jaw. "You found them," Praxos stated. It was not a question. Lycastus nodded, his throat working. He seemed unable to speak. He simply handed the Archon a small, tightly sealed waterskin. "The sound," he rasped, his voice a stranger's. "I had a man fill this from the sea near the rocks. Listen to it." Puzzled, Praxos held the taut skin of goat hide to his ear. He heard nothing but the slosh of the water. He was about to ask what foolishness this was when he felt it, a vibration, incredibly faint, that traveled through the water and the leather into the bones of his skull. With it came a psychic echo, a high, thin note of pure misery that made the hairs on his arms stand up. It was the memory of the sound, trapped within the water itself. He dropped the waterskin as if it were a hot coal. "Gods," he breathed, his composure finally cracking. "There are no gods in that place," Lycastus said, his voice hollow. "Only things that have been there forever." He began to speak, the words tumbling out of him in a torrent, a confession to purge the horror from his mind. He described the black, weeping spires. He described the wailing figure, Steno, her bronze hair and brass claws, eternally tearing at her own immortal flesh in a prison of grief. He described the other one, Uriel, the leaper, the hunter, with her cold obsidian eyes filled with a hunger that was not of the world. "She played with us, Archon," he said, his voice cracking, "like a cat with a mouse. She could have taken us at any moment. She was amusing herself. We were not worth the effort of the kill." He gripped Praxos's arm, his fingers digging in like a vice. "You asked me if they were a weapon? That is like asking if a plague is a weapon. Yes, you can unleash it, but it will not distinguish between your enemy and you. It will consume everything. If they were to come here,
If she were to call them, he trailed off, his gaze fixed on the lights of the Acropolis high above. They would not just destroy Argos, they would unmake it. They would scour the stone and salt the earth with their sorrow and their hunger until nothing was left but a memory of weeping. Praxos stood in silence, absorbing the captain's terrified report. The information was of physical weight. His gambit, his last resort, was not just a failure. It was a glimpse into an abyss he hadn't known existed. He had considered bringing 2 more vipers into the bed. Lycastus had told him he was proposing to set the entire house, the entire world on fire. "Your ship is to be quarantined," Praxos said finally, his mind racing, recalculating everything. "No man leaves it. No one speaks of what you saw. You will be paid, Captain, more than we agreed. You will buy yourself a new ship, and you will sail to the farthest corners of the world and forget the name Argos." "I can't forget," Lycastus whispered, releasing his grip. "That sound is in my bones now. I will hear it until the day I die." He turned and walked back toward his ship of haunted men, a captain with no destination left but escape. Praxos remained in the shadows, his mind a whirlwind. The sisters were not a weapon against Medusa. They were a threat to her. If they learned she was here, alive and powerful, the little mortal sister who had made herself their equal, their reaction would not be familial reunion. It would be an eruption of ancient, unimaginable jealousy and rage. Theron had been right. They would see her apotheosis as an intolerable arrogance. His strategy had to change, instantly and completely. He could no longer afford to provoke Medusa. He could not risk her doing something so catastrophic that her sisters might somehow sense it across the world. The game was no longer about defeating her. It was about containing her. He had to placate her, calm her, keep her quiet. He had just spent 2 days orchestrating the most profound psychological insult imaginable. Now, with the full moon just 1 day away, he had to undo it. He had to soothe the goddess whose rage he had so expertly stoked. It was an impossible task, and failure meant not just the destruction of Argos by Medusa, but the potential unmaking of the world by her kin. He looked up at the Parthenon, a faint light in the darkness. He had wanted to cage her in pity. Now he realized he was trapped in the cage with her, and 2 far greater monsters were listening for the rattling of the bars. Praxos had meant to wound her. He had succeeded more than he could ever know. The story he had told was a cage of truth, and its bars were her own memories. For the rest of the day, Medusa did not move from the temple entrance. She watched the city, but she did not see it. She saw a cold, lightless cave. She heard the grating hiss of Sthenos' thoughts, felt the sharp, probing contempt of Euryale. The pity of Argos was a shroud they were trying to wrap her in, to bury her alive in the memory of the girl she had been. When dusk finally painted the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, Ilara approached her again. She had not burned the offerings. They were gathered in a basket at her feet. "I could not do it, goddess," she whispered, her head bowed. "They are symbols of pain, yes, but the people who gave them, their hearts were not malicious. They were trying to understand, to connect." Medusa turned her head slowly. Her eyes, for a moment, just a moment, were not the cold obsidian depths of a deity, but the haunted eyes of a survivor. And what do you think they understand, child? They understand that you suffered, Ilara said, her voice gaining a quiet conviction. Praxos meant for it to make you smaller, but for some, it has made you holier. They see that the gods who are worshipped with feasts and festivals are capricious and cruel. They see you, who endured their cruelty, and they feel a kinship. It is not just pity, goddess, it is recognition. Recognition. The word struck Medusa with the force of a physical blow. She had sought recognition of her power, of her vengeance. She had never considered that they might recognize her pain. She looked at the pathetic offerings in the basket, the shell, the tiny sandals. They were not chains. They were mirrors. In her, the people of Argos saw their own small, mortal griefs reflected on a divine scale. Their lost children, their silent sorrows, their helplessness before the whims of fate and power. Praxos had thought to cage her in her past. Instead, he had given her an army of silent witnesses. You are wise for a mortal, Ilara, Medusa said, and the rawness was gone from her voice, replaced by a chilling clarity. The path forward was suddenly illuminated, not by the fire of rage, but by the cold light of purpose. She would not reject their story, she would claim it. She would own every scar they had put on public display and turn it into a weapon far sharper than fear. Burn them, she said again, but her tone was different. It was not a command of revulsion, but of ritual. Burn them not as an insult to me, but as an offering to her, to the girl who was. Let the smoke carry her memory away. Her story is over. Mine is about to begin. Ilara understood. She took the basket to the great bronze brazier in the temple's center. As she laid the items on the coals, she wept silently. Not for the goddess before her, but for the ghost of the girl who had been sacrificed to create her. The tiny leather sandals curled and blackened, turning to ash, a final, belated funeral pyre lit 3,000 years too late. Praxos sat in his study, the map Lycastus had returned spread on the table before him. The mourning archipelago, a place that should not exist, a cancer on the edge of the world. He had not slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the captain's description of Steno, the grieving automaton, and Euryale, the predatory hunter. He felt the phantom vibration from the waterskin. He had made a catastrophic error. In trying to find a sword, he had discovered the key to Pandora's own box. His entire strategy, built on provocation and control, was now a liability. He had to pivot from aggressor to supplicant, and he has less than a day to do it. He summoned Theron. The old scribe arrived looking frail in the pre-dawn light, his robes smelling of dust and stale wine. You read the mood in the agora, Praxos began, his voice tight. What is the city's heart now? It is a confused heart, Theron rasped. You gave them a monster to fear, then you gave them a martyr to pity. They do not know which altar to pray at. You have broken the singular narrative, Archon, but what rises in its place may be no more controllable. I no longer wish to control it, Praxos confessed, the admission costing him dearly. I wish to contain it. The information I have received, it changes the nature of the threat. She must not be provoked further. We must prevent a cataclysm. Theron's rheumy eyes sharpened. What information? Praxos waved a dismissive hand. That is my burden. Yours is to help me find a path to appeasement. The full moon is tomorrow night, her deadline. What can we offer a goddess whose entire existence is predicated on our injustice? An apology? Theron suggested, his tone laced with its usual cynicism. An apology is an admission of guilt. It would only feed her righteousness, Praxos countered. No, it must be an offering, something that acknowledges the truth of the story we ourselves told and offers restitution for it. He paced the room, his mind sifting through the levers of power he knew. Gold, land, titles, sacrifices, all of them were meaningless here. We cannot give her back her mortality. We cannot punish the gods who wronged her. So what is left? Theron was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. You said it yourself, old friend. You are fighting a narrative. An offering of gold is an answer in prose. You need an answer in poetry. He leaned forward, his voice a dry whisper. You told the story of her violation in a temple. The injustice was not just the act, but the desecration of a sacred space. So, you build her a new one, not on the Acropolis, in the shadow of the old gods, but somewhere new, somewhere that is hers alone. You do not offer her a place among the pantheon, you offer her a kingdom of her own. Praxos stopped pacing. A new temple. An act of creation, not submission. It was an acknowledgement of her power, a ceding of ground, but it was also a form of containment. A gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. And the water? Praxos asked, a sudden, chilling thought occurring to him. The fountain in the agora, the city's wells. What if she turns them to salt as she threatened? Then we offer her a new source, Theron said simply. There is an ancient freshwater spring on the slopes of Mount Lycovitos, outside the city walls. It has been capped for generations. Legend says its waters run deeper and colder than any other. Consecrate it to her. Give her the spring. Give her the land for a temple. You are not just giving her objects, you are giving her geography. You are writing her into the very landscape of Argos, on her own terms. It is an offer of immense honor. It may be enough to make her pause. Praxos looked at the old scribe, a flicker of his old respect returning. It was a brilliant, desperate gambit. It was an act of supplication disguised as an act of piety. It would cost the city nothing but pride, and it might just buy them their survival. The first sign was subtle. In the fish market by the port, the water in the clay basins used to keep the catch fresh began to feel unnaturally cold. A fisherman, plunging his hands in to retrieve a string of mackerels, pulled them out with a curse, his fingers numb and blue as if he dipped them in a winter stream. By mid-morning, the water in the public fountain in the agora had taken on a strange, dark clarity, as if it were deeper than the stone basin that held it. When children splashed in it, they complained that the water didn't feel wet, that it clung to their skin with a strange oily chill. Praxos, observing from the portico of the Archon's hall, felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. He remembered the waterskin Lycastus had given him, the memory of sorrow trapped in the water itself. He looked towards the sea. The tide was unusually low, exposing a wide band of dark, foul-smelling mud. The harbor was eerily quiet. No gulls cried. The very air seemed to hold its breath. Something was listening. Something was stirring in the deep places of the world, its attention snagged by the psychic disturbance radiating from Argos. He had to act, now. He sent for the stone carvers and the heralds, his orders precise and urgent. There would be a new proclamation before sundown. An answer, an offering. He only prayed it would be enough. 3. Medusa felt the change in the water. It was a faint resonance, a whisper of the outer sea's cold, profound grief touching the shores of the mortal world. It was the echo of her sisters. A shiver, not of fear, but of cold, hard fury, passed through her. They were a part of her story, the part she had never been able to escape. Praxos had dragged them out of the shadows of her memory, and now their psychic stench was beginning to seep into her new world.
She would not be defined by them. She would not be defined by Praxos's pity. She would define herself. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the agora, she descended the temple steps. She did not storm down them as a monster, nor did she glide as a goddess. She walked with the deliberate, heavy tread of a woman going to face her executioner. Ilara followed a pace behind, her heart pounding. The city, sensing the moment had arrived, fell silent. People emerged from their homes and shops, their faces pale, drawn to the spectacle. She stopped at the bottom of the steps, standing before the two marble slabs, her demand and their answer. Her gaze fell upon the second stone, the story of her life. The cold marble did not shatter. It did not turn to dust. Under her palm, the stone seemed to sigh, its crystalline structure loosening, not with decay, but with a deep, resonant sorrow. Where her fingers rested, the pale marble darkened, becoming translucent and gray, like quartz found deep within a sea cave. The crowd gasped, a single unified sound of disbelief. Then, a single drop of water, impossibly clear, welled up from the heart of the letter spelling out her name. It traced the curve of the carving before falling, leaving a glistening trail on the stone face. Another followed, then another. From the engraved lines of the story Praxos had written to cage her, water began to seep, as if the marble itself were weeping for the girl it described. The trickles joined, flowing down the slab to pool at its base on the agora's paving stones. An old woman near the front, her face a roadmap of hard years, broke from the mesmerized crowd. She shuffled forward, ignoring the nervous murmurs, and dipped a trembling finger into the small, growing puddle. She brought it to her lips. Her eyes widened. She looked up at Medusa, and in her gaze there was no longer terror, but a vast and sorrowful awe. "It is salt," the woman whispered, her voice carrying in the unnatural silence. "Like tears." Medusa did not acknowledge her. Her eyes were fixed on the Archon's hall, where she could feel the frantic, calculating mind of Praxos watching. She had taken his weapon, his story, and turned it into a holy relic. She had made her pain a source of miracles. Your move, old man. As if in answer, the great bronze doors of the hall opened. It was not Praxos who emerged, but the same herald who had read the proclamation, flanked now by two city guards whose expressions were a mixture of duty and stark terror. He walked to the center of the agora, unrolling a new scroll. His voice, when it came, was not the trembling whisper of the day before, but a loud, formal declaration that rang with forced conviction. "By decree of the Archons of Argos," he boomed, his voice echoing off the stone, "the city acknowledges the divinity of the one who dwells within the temple of the goddess. We have heard her story, and we see her power. We have wronged her, not with malice, but with ignorance. That ignorance ends today." He took a deep breath.
In restitution for the desecration she suffered, in honor of the power she now wields, the city of Argos grants to her, in perpetuity, the sacred lands upon the northern slope of Mount Lycabettus. We shall build there a new temple, a house for her glory, so that all may know her name and her story. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. A new temple! It was an unthinkable concession. The herald raised his voice higher, determined to be heard over the rising tide of astonishment. Furthermore, we consecrate to her the ancient spring known as the Cria Pigi, the cold spring, whose waters run from the heart of the mountain. Let it be her sacred font, a source of her power, a gift from a city that seeks not her wrath, but her presence. The offer hung in the air, audacious and absolute. It was a surrender wrapped in the robes of piety. Praxos was not just offering a truce, he was offering her a permanent place in the world, a seat of power grounded in earth and stone and living water. He was trying to anchor her, to give her something to protect, something to rule instead of something to destroy. Medusa slowly withdrew her hand from the weeping stone. The flow of water did not cease. She turned her gaze from the herald to the great fountain that was the centerpiece of the agora. It was the heart of the city's public life, the place where the news was shared, where children played, where the thirsty came. Its waters, which had been growing colder all day, now swirled with a dark, unsettling energy. Without a word, she raised her hand, palm open, towards it. The cheerful bubbling of the fountain ceased. The water stilled, its surface becoming as smooth and black as polished obsidian. A low hum vibrated through the stones, a sound felt in the teeth and the bones. Then, from the center of the pool, a thick white rime of frost began to spread, racing across the black surface. In seconds, the entire fountain was frozen solid, the ice not clear, but a milky, opaque white, like the eye of a blind oracle. A wave of cold, smelling of the deep, sunless sea, washed over the crowd, making them cry out and stumble back. She had shown them the consequence, the death of their water, the end of their city. She held the moment, letting the absolute cold silence their every thought. Then she slowly closed her hand into a fist. With a sound like a thunderclap, the ice in the fountain shattered, exploding not outwards, but inwards, collapsing into the basin. The black water surged, and then, miraculously, it began to clear. The inky darkness dissolved, the unnatural cold receded. The water that refilled the basin was of a clarity and purity none had ever seen. So clean, it seemed to magnify the colorful mosaics at the bottom of the pool. The gentle, familiar sound of the bubbling water returned, but it was richer now, more vibrant, like the sound of life itself. She had shown them mercy. She turned her gaze back to the herald, who stood frozen in place, the scroll trembling in his hands. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the silent square. "The spring will be my voice," she declared. "The temple will be my memory. I accept." With that, she turned and ascended the steps back to her temple, Elara trailing in her wake like a shadow. She did not look back. She did not need to. She could feel the city's heart beating again, a frantic, terrified, grateful rhythm. She had won. She had taken their fear, their pity, and their politics, and from them she had forged a throne. From the portico, Praxos watched her disappear into the shadows of the Parthenon. He leaned heavily against a marble column, the strength draining from his legs. Cleon and the other Archons were babbling, a mixture of panicked relief and sheer disbelief at what they had just witnessed. "She accepted! By the gods, she accepted!" Cleon was saying, wiping sweat from his brow with a trembling hand. "Your gambit worked, Praxos! You've saved us!" Praxos closed his eyes. Saved them? He had just presided over the formal birth of a new god, one born of trauma and rage. He had legitimized her, given her land, water, a place in the fabric of their world. He had not banished the monster, he had invited her to stay forever. He had stopped the city from being destroyed today, but he had mortgaged its soul for tomorrow. The weeping stone, the frozen fountain, these were not the tricks of a vengeful spirit. They were acts of creation and control on a fundamental level. He had been playing checkers with a force that moved mountains. "We have not saved Argos," he said, his voice a low, weary rasp that cut through their self-congratulation. "We have merely purchased a reprieve. Pray to whatever gods you have left that the price was not too high." On the quarantined deck of the Sea Serpent, the night was filled with the low groans of timbers and the soft whimpers of sleeping men. Lycastus stood watch, unable to rest, his gaze fixed on the open sea, as if expecting a black-sailed ship to emerge from the darkness. A scream tore through the night. It came from the cramped forecastle, where the men slept. It was not a scream of pain, but of a mind-shattering terror. Lycastus drew his short sword and ran towards the sound, followed by a bleary-eyed Nereus. They found a young sailor, a boy from Naxos named Icarus, thrashing in his hammock, his eyes wide open, but seeing nothing in the cramped lamplit space. He was clawing at his own face, his mouth wide in a silent shriek, his body rigid with horror. "He's been like this for an hour," another sailor whispered, huddled in the corner, muttering in his sleep about the island. As Lycastus reached him, Icarus's body went limp, his head fell back, and he began to speak, his voice a dry, rattling hiss, completely unlike his own. "She is found," the voice rasped, a sibilant whisper that made the lamp flame gutter. "The little sister is found. The mayfly plays at being a god. She sings her little song of power so loudly." A new wave of tremors seized the boy's body. He began to weep, but the sound was thin and high and horribly familiar. The sound carries over the water, a new song in the world. The Farspringer hears it. She lifts her head from her meal. She listens. So much noise from the little, soft, dying one. A new wave of tremors seized the boy's body. He began to weep, but the sound was thin and high and horribly familiar. It was the wailing of Steno, a sound of eternal, inconsolable grief issuing from a mortal throat. "The mighty one feels it too," the voice hissed through the weeping. "A ripple in her long sorrow, a stone tossed in her endless pool, a sister's pride, an intolerable thing." Praxos arrived at the wharf before the body was even cold. A single hooded lantern was his only companion, casting a swaying circle of light in the thick harbor fog. Lycastus met him by the gangplank, his face a bloodless mask in the gloom. He didn't speak, merely gestured with his head toward the ship. The air aboard the Sea Serpent was thick with a new kind of fear, colder and more profound than what they had brought back from the islands. It was the fear of contagion, not of the body, but of the soul. The boy Icarus was laid out on the deck, covered by a piece of sailcloth. The other sailors were huddled at the stern, as far away as they could get, their faces turned from the corpse, as if looking at it might invite the same fate. "He spoke," Lycastus said, his voice a dead monotone. "As he was dying, or something spoke through him." He recounted the chilling message, word for word, the sibilant hiss of the possessed voice still echoing in his memory. He spoke of the far springer lifting her head, of the mighty one's sorrow being disturbed, of them looking this way. Praxos listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When Lycastus finished, the Archon knelt beside the body. With a steady hand, he drew back the sailcloth. The boy's face was peaceful, but his skin had a strange grayish tinge, and around his open, staring eyes, a fine, crystalline powder, like sea salt, had formed. Praxos touched it with his finger. It was cold, and it did not dissolve. "This is not a sickness," Praxos said, his voice quiet but absolute. "This is a sending, a reply." He stood up, his gaze sweeping over the terrified crew, then settling on Lycastus. "This ship is no longer quarantined. It is a tomb. It will be burned." Lycastus flinched. "My ship? My men and I?" "You and your men will be given passage on a grain transport leaving for Egypt at dawn," Praxos cut him off, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You will be given new names and enough silver to disappear. What you brought back is not a memory, Captain. It is a seed, and I will not have it taking root in Argos." He looked at the corpse of the young sailor. "His death was a message for me. I have received it." As Lycastus numbly began to rouse his ghost-like crew, Praxos walked to the railing of the ship and looked back across the dark water towards the Acropolis. The single lamp burning in the Parthenon seemed impossibly small and fragile. He had bought a day's peace for his city, and in doing so had alerted the apocalypse to their location. The irony was so bitter it felt like a physical poison. In the temple, the atmosphere had transformed. The sharp tang of fear was gone, replaced by a low, resonant hum of awe. The offerings had already begun to change. No longer were they simple tokens of appeasement. A master stonemason had spent the night carving a small, perfect replica of the weeping stone, its surface slick with oil to mimic tears. A poet had left a scroll containing a hymn, not to Medusa the monster, but to Our Lady of Unjust Sorrows. A new faith was being born, its liturgy written in real time by the people themselves. Ilara moved through it all with a newfound purpose. She was no longer just an acolyte, a servant. She was an interpreter, a conduit. She organized the offerings, spoke in low, comforting tones to the supplicants who now dared to approach the temple steps, and explained the meaning of the miracles they had witnessed. She was shaping the narrative, giving their awe a vocabulary. Medusa watched from the dais, a silent, still center to the burgeoning storm of worship. She felt the shift in the city's heart. It was a heady, intoxicating sensation, a current of pure belief flowing directly to her, nourishing the divine power she now held. It was more potent than fear, deeper and more sustaining. Fear was a scream. This was a chorus. Yet, beneath the warmth of this new power, she felt a cold spot, a psychic deadness that had not been there before. It was a subtle thing, like a single note in the city's chorus that was flat and discordant. It felt familiar. A cold, static-laced emptiness that reminded her of the endless, unchanging gray of the island. She had assumed it was an echo of her own recalled memories, a phantom limb of her past still aching. She focused her will, trying to isolate the feeling. It was not coming from within her. It was coming from the harbor. A knot of psychic energy that was cold, silent, and utterly final. It felt like a door being closed, a life extinguished not by passion or violence, but by a great and terrible pressure, like a creature of the deep succumbing to the weight of the sea. "Elara," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet reverence of the temple. The girl was instantly at her side. "Goddess? There is a death in the city," Medusa said, her brow furrowed. "Down at the port. It is wrong. It does not feel like a mortal passing." She looked at Elara, her dark eyes searching. "My senses are tied to this city now, but my sight is still limited. Go, find out what has happened." On the morning archipelago, the wailing of Steno faltered for the first time in 1,000 years. The high, keening sound that was the island's weather, its soul, hitched and then fell silent. The sudden quiet was more shocking than the noise had ever been. Steno, the mighty, sat unmoving on her spire, her brass claws still. The self-inflicted wounds on her gray arms ceased their endless cycle of tearing and healing. Her head, with its mane of bronze wire, lifted slowly. Her eyes, the color of lead, were not focused on the gray sea before her, but inward, on a new sensation that had pierced the thick fog of her eternal grief. It was a flicker of warmth, a pulse of dynamic, changing energy, a memory. "Little sister," her thought, was not a word, but a feeling, heavy and grinding as a glacier. She makes waves. She disturbs the sorrow. From a lower ledge, Uriel, the far springer, uncoiled. She had been gnawing on the petrified remains of a giant squid, her sharp teeth scraping patterns in the fossilized bone. She, too, had felt it. To her, it was not a disturbance, but a scent. A complex, fascinating scent of mortal rage and immortal power, a combination that should not exist. It was the scent of prey that had learned to hunt. "She sings." Uriel's thought was sharp, quick, and laced with a predatory curiosity. A loud song, for a mayfly. She thinks she is a dragon now. Steno's attention turned from the psychic disturbance to her sister. Pride, a mortal sickness. She has caught it. It must be cleansed. Uriel sprang to her feet, her mottled green scales seeming to ripple. She bounded from her ledge to a higher spire, landing without a sound, her movements a blur of reptilian grace. She tasted the air, her forked tongue flickering. The scent was stronger now, a clear line drawn across the psychic sea, leading east. "It is a long way to swim," Uriel thought, a flicker of cruel amusement in her mind. "The world is large, full of soft, squeaking things to eat along the way." Steno rose to her full, terrifying height. Her grief, for a moment, was eclipsed by a more ancient, more fundamental emotion, a sense of cosmic order being violated. Their nest had been one of stasis, of eternal, unchanging misery and hunger. The mortal one was an anomaly, but a contained one. She had been mortal. She had been slain. The story had ended correctly. But this new song, this pulse of power, was a new chapter, an incorrect one, an intolerable one. "We will correct the story," Steno's thought boomed across the silent rocks, a promise of geological violence. "The sea will carry us. The world will remember why there were only ever meant to be two of us." The wailing did not resume. The silence that now gripped the morning archipelago was the silence of purpose, the silence of a hunt about to begin. Theron found Praxos in the city archives, a labyrinthine basement beneath the Archon's hall, surrounded by thousands of scrolls that smelled of time and decay. The Archon was not reading. He was staring at a faded nautical chart, his finger tracing a path from Argos eastward, into the unknown. "The ship is gone," Praxos said, without looking up. "Scuttled and burned in the deep channel before the sun was fully risen. The crew is on its way to Egypt. The seed is unplanted. But the message remains," Theron rasped, leaning on his walking stick. What was it? What could have terrified Lycastus so much he would have—
"The answer, if one exists, will not be in charts of the known world," Theron said, his voice a dry rustle of parchment. He pushed himself off the stool and shuffled towards a towering stack of scrolls bound in blackened leather. "We are dealing with a pre-human logic, a mythology that existed before the first poet gave it a name." He ran a gnarled finger down the clay tags. "The stories we tell are a thin crust of soil over a bedrock of things we have forgotten how to fear." Praxos watched him, a sliver of hope warring with his profound despair. "What are you looking for?" "A weakness, a rule, a pattern," Theron replied, pulling out a heavy scroll that groaned in protest. He unrolled it on the table, revealing not a map, but a complex series of celestial diagrams and esoteric symbols. "These forces, Steno and Euryale, they are constants. They do not change, they do not grow, they simply are. Their grief and their hunger are as fundamental as gravity. But even gravity is subject to laws. We must find the laws that govern them." He peered at the archaic script. "There are apocryphal texts, fragments from before the Titanomachy, that speak of the primordials as being bound to certain principles, sympathies, antipathies, geographies of power. If she, Medusa, has become a true goddess, she has also become a nexus of power, a new pole in the world's magnetic field. We need to understand how her new nature interacts with their ancient one." "And if there are no laws that can help us?" Praxos asked, his voice bleak. "If they are simply a tide of death that cannot be turned?" Theron looked up from the scroll, his eyes like chips of flint in the lantern light. "Then I will find the oldest story of the end of the world, Archon, so we might at least know the name of our doom." Elara found the harbor shrouded in a fog that felt different from the usual sea mist. It was thin and acrid, carrying the scent of charred wood and something else, a faint metallic tang of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike that had hit too close. The usual bustle was gone. Fishermen mended their nets in tight, silent groups, their movements jerky, and their eyes constantly scanning the gray water. The news of the sea serpent's fate had spread not as a story, but as a feeling, a shared dread that needed no words. She approached an old netmaker named Philon, a man whose hands were as gnarled as the olive trees on the hills. He was staring at the empty mooring where the ship had been. "What happened here?" Elara asked, her voice quiet. Philon started, not having heard her approach. He squinted at her robes, recognizing the markings of the new temple. "The Archon's business," he muttered, turning back to the water. "A cursed ship. Best it's gone." "Cursed how?" she pressed gently. He hesitated, then seemed to decide that speaking to a priestess was better than holding the fear inside. "It came back wrong," he whispered, his gaze darting around. "The crew, they were like men who had seen their own ghosts. And last night, a boy died. I heard the scream. Then, before dawn, the Archon's men came.
They herded the crew off like prisoners, towed the ship out past the breakwater. He pointed with his chin towards the open sea. Set it ablaze, a pyre for a ship. It burned with a cold fire, priestess, green and blue flames that gave off no heat. It just dissolved into the fog. A cold fire, the phrase snagged in Alara's mind. And the boy who died? Taken away, but one of the men who carried him dropped this. Philon reached into his pouch and held out a small, flat stone. It was a common worry stone, polished smooth by a thumb, but its surface was covered in a fine, glittering frost that did not melt in the mild air. Alara took it. It was so cold it burned her fingers, an impossible, enduring cold that seemed to suck the warmth from her very bones. She could feel the echo of the dead sailor's final terror clinging to it. This was the source of the cold spot her goddess had felt. Far to the west, on a small, nameless island inhabited by a single family of goat herders, the day began like any other. The patriarch, a grizzled man named Lycos, led his flock to the high pastures, his 2 sons trailing behind. It was his daughter, Chloe, who saw it first. She was down by the shore, gathering shellfish from the tide pools, when the sea went silent. The gentle lapping of the waves against the shingle simply ceased. The water, a moment before a cheerful Aegean blue, turned a flat, dead gray, its surface becoming unnaturally smooth, like oiled slate. A shadow fell over the island, though there were no clouds in the sky. Chloe looked up from her basket, a prickle of unease running down her spine. Far out on the horizon, she saw 2 shapes moving through the water. They were not ships. They moved too fast, cutting through the calm sea without a wake, like blades slicing through silk. One was a blocky, dark shape, low in the water, a moving reef of sorrow. The other was longer, sinuous, a flicker of green and bronze that leaped and plunged with a terrifying, playful speed. The goats on the high cliffs began to scream. It was not their usual bleating, but a high, thin sound of pure panic. Chloe dropped her basket and ran, scrambling up the path towards their small stone hut. Inside, her mother was staring at the clay pot of water drawn from their well that morning. A web of black ice was spreading from the bottom of the pot, crawling up the sides, though the air in the hut was warm. The water was freezing from the inside out. When Lycos and his sons came running down from the pasture, their faces white with fear, the family huddled together inside their home, listening to the silence of the Dead Sea. They did not see the 2 figures come ashore. They did not hear a single footstep on the gravel. They only heard the sound of their hut's simple wooden door splintering into 1,000 pieces. Medusa stood before the new altar, her hand resting on the perfect miniature of the weeping stone. Through it, she could feel the pulse of her city, the collective sigh of relief, the burgeoning awe, the threads of thousands of lives weaving a tapestry of belief around her. It was a symphony of mortal emotion, and she was its conductor. She reached out with her senses towards the mountain, towards the gift Praxos had given her. She found the capped spring, a deep, sleeping artery of pure water within the rock. A gentle nudge of her will was all it took. Deep underground, a stone that had blocked the flow for centuries cracked and shifted. The water, ancient and cold, began to move, seeking its new path. She would have a temple built, but not the gilded cage Praxos intended. It would be an open-air sanctuary of black stone and running water, a place of stark, honest sorrow and undeniable power. A place where mortals could come and see their own pain reflected in the eyes of a goddess who truly understood it, for she had mastered it. Her victory was complete. She had not just cowed the city, she had captured its soul. Her rage had been the key, but their belief was the lock she had turned. She had remade herself, remade her story, and in doing so was remaking the world around her. The familiar chill of Ilara's return cut through her reverie. The girl knelt, her breathing ragged from her hurried journey back to the Acropolis. She held out the frozen worry stone. "Goddess," Ilara began, her voice strained. "There was a death, a sailor on a ship called the Sea Serpent. The ship came from the west. They burned it this morning on the Archon's orders." Sea Serpent. The name was a dissonant clang in the symphony. A ship from the west. The cold spot. A dead sailor. A cold fire. Medusa took the stone. The frigid energy that pulsed from it was not the cold of ice or winter. It was the cold of absolute, unchanging stasis. The cold of the place she was born. "He spoke before he died," Ilara continued, relaying the netmaker's second-hand story. "The men on the docks are afraid to repeat the words, but they say he spoke of an island, of sisters." The pieces clicked into place with the sickening finality of a crypt door swinging shut. The ship that had spied on her home. The lingering psychic taint. The dead sailor used as a mouthpiece. A message. A reply. Praxos had not just told her story to Argos. His sailors had carried the news of her existence back out into the world. A ripple spreading across the sea. A ripple that had finally reached the shore of her own personal hell. The warmth of her newfound divinity vanished, extinguished by a cold that was bone deep and 3,000 years old. The awe of her worshippers, the pulse of the city, the promise of her new temple, it all became distant and meaningless. She was no longer a goddess celebrating her victory. She was the mortal girl again, the fragile songbird, hiding in the shadows of the cave. The worry stone was not merely cold, it was a void. It did not radiate coldness so much as it drank warmth, pulling the heat from Medusa's divine flesh, leaving her fingers numb and dead. In its frozen heart, she felt the psychic signature of her sisters, the vast, static grief of Steno, and the sharp, predatory hunger of Euryale. They were not just an idea, not just a memory anymore. They were a reality, a vector, a direction, and they were pointed at her. The temple, which moments before had felt like a throne room, suddenly felt like a cage again. The adoring prayers of the city, the symphony of belief she had been conducting, became a meaningless buzz in the face of that ancient, silent cold. What good was the worship of mayflies against the coming of a glacier? "Goddess?" Ilara's voice was a pinprick of concern in the roaring silence of Medusa's mind. Medusa dropped the stone. It clattered on the marble floor, a sound as sharp and final as a bone breaking. She turned away from her priestess, walking towards the dark interior of the temple, her steps unsteady for the first time. The shadows welcomed her, wrapping around her like a familiar shroud. She had spent millennia in the dark. It had been her shield. Now it felt like her tomb. She had been a fool, a proud, arrogant fool. She had thought her enemy was a city of mortals and the memory of a fickle Olympian. She had focused her rage on Praxos, on Athena, on the story of her own violation. But they were merely the prologue.
The true story, the one she had been running from since the moment of her first mortal breath, had always been about her sisters. They were the architects of her first prison. They had defined her by her weakness, her softness, her mortality. Her apotheosis, her claim to power, was not just a challenge to the gods of Olympus. It was an act of rebellion against the crushing, eternal stasis of her own family, and they would not suffer it. "They will unmake me," she whispered to the shadows, the words a confession of the deepest terror she had ever known. Not of death, she had known that, but of erasure. They would not just kill her, they would scour her from the world, dismantle her new divinity, and pull her back into their endless, gray narrative of sorrow and hunger. She would become a footnote in their story again, the failed experiment, the mayfly who thought she was a dragon. Ilara followed her, her soft footsteps hesitant. She did not speak, but her presence was a question. Medusa could feel the girl's confusion, her faith trembling. Her goddess, who had frozen fountains and made stone weep, was now cowering in the dark. "You worship a lie, little priestess," Medusa said, her voice flat and devoid of its divine resonance. "You pray to a tower of rage built on a foundation of fear, and the foundation is cracking." In the archives, Theron let the ancient scroll roll shut, a cloud of papyrus dust rising into the lantern light. He had found it, not a solution, but the shape of the problem. "It is as I feared," he said, his voice raspy with awe and dread. "The texts call it the Gorgon dyad, a principle of cosmic balance. They are a binary system, Praxos, a matched set. One is the embodiment of endless sorrow, the potential energy of grief. The other is the embodiment of insatiable hunger, the kinetic energy of predation. Together, they form a stable, closed loop, a force of nature that polices the outer edges of creation." Praxos felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air of the archives. And Medusa? "She was the anomaly," Theron said, tapping the scroll. "A mortal element introduced into an immortal system. The myths say she was made a Gorgon, but these older texts imply she was catalyzed. Her mortality was a flaw in their perfection, a discordant note in their eternal song. That is why they kept her, tormented her. She was a constant, infuriating reminder that their state was not the only one. When Perseus killed her, he did not just slay a monster. He unknowingly performed a ritual of cosmic housekeeping. He restored the dyad, he put the universe back in balance." Praxos stared at the scribe, the monstrous implications of his words dawning on him. "So her rebirth, her new godhood, is the most profound imbalance imaginable," Theron finished for him. "She has not just returned, she has returned more powerful. She has created a new pole of power where one should not exist. The dyad is broken." "Steno and Euryale are not coming here for revenge, Archon. They are coming to restore the balance. They are the world's immune system, and Medusa is the disease. They will not stop until she is gone." "Then we must kill her ourselves," Praxos said, the words tasting like ash. "Before they get here, cut out the disease to save the body." "And how do you propose we do that?" Theron countered, a flicker of his old cynicism returning. "She commands the very water in our wells. She is intertwined with the belief of the entire populace. Killing her now would be like trying to cut a heart out of a living man with a spoon. It would destroy us in the process. And even if we succeeded, what then? We would have a dead goddess on our hands and two primordial forces still heading our way, drawn to the lingering scent of their sister's power. No, killing her is not the answer. Then what is? Praxos demanded, his voice cracking with desperation. Theron pointed a trembling finger. Her anchor. The word resonated within her, not as a metaphor, but as a physical truth. She looked at Alara, at the fierce, fragile mortality burning in the girl's eyes, and felt it. She was no longer a ghost hunting the world. She was tied to it, tied by the threads of belief, by the geography of her new temple, by the living water of the spring that now answered to her will. This was her land. This was her city, and they would not take it from her. You are right, Medusa said, and the divine power flowed back into her voice, cold and clear as the water from her spring. I am the goddess of Argos. Let them come. Let them see what a mayfly can do when she is no longer afraid of the dark. Praxos moved with the feverish energy of a man who had seen the abyss and was now desperately building a bridge across it. While Medusa found her resolve, he marshaled the resources of the city for a task that seemed like madness to his fellow Archons. A statue? Cleon had sputtered, his face incredulous. At a time like this, you are commissioning a work of art? It is not art. It is an anchor, Praxos had retorted, his voice cutting through all argument. He summoned the finest sculptor in the city, a man named Phidias, whose skill with marble was said to be a gift from the gods themselves. He gave the sculptor his instructions, not in the Archon's hall, but in the desolate silence of the archives, with Theron's ancient scroll spread between them. You will carve a girl, Praxos commanded, his finger tracing a diagram on the scroll that Phidias could not comprehend. A priestess of Athena, no older than 16. She must not be idealized. I want you to carve her innocence, her devotion. Carve the hope in her eyes before it was stolen. Carve her as she was, in every detail. It must be the truest thing you have ever made. The city's survival depends on its truth. Phidias, unnerved by the Archon's intensity, but compelled by his authority, set to work. He toiled without rest, his chisels ringing day and night in a closed workshop, as if he too could feel the world holding its breath. The day they came, the sky did not darken with clouds. It simply lost its color, fading to a uniform, washed-out gray. A profound silence fell over Argos, swallowing every sound, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the cry of gulls, the laughter of children, until the only sound left was the frantic beating of one's own heart. Then came the wave of feeling. From the west, it rolled over the city, a psychic tsunami. For half the city, it was a grief so absolute that buckled the knees and stole the breath, a sorrow for losses they had never experienced. Men wept for children they'd never had, women keened for parents who were still alive. Life became a burden too heavy to bear. This was the touch of Steno. For the other half, it was a gnawing, predatory hunger, a suspicion that turned neighbor against neighbor, a sudden sharp desire to take, to own, to consume. Fights broke out over a dropped piece of fruit. Old friends eyed each other with a cold, calculating avarice. This was the whisper of Euryale. Only on the slopes of the Acropolis did the psychic assault weaken. The collective belief of the people, focused on Medusa's temple, created a sanctuary of sorts, a bubble of resistance against the tide of despair and malice.
Medusa stood at the entrance of her temple, looking down at the city she now claimed. She felt the twin poisons of her sister's auras seeping into her people, and a rage colder and purer than any she had felt before rose within her. This was not about her anymore. They were trespassing. They were tainting her domain. She descended the steps, Alara at her side. The people huddled in the agora looked up, their faces masks of misery or suspicion. But as Medusa walked among them, her presence a focused point of cold, defiant power, the fog in their eyes began to clear. She was a different kind of primordial force, one they had chosen, one rooted in a suffering they could understand. She walked through the city, her gaze fixed on the harbor. The sea was a sheet of lead, flat and lifeless. Two figures stood on the shore, having emerged from the water without a single ripple. Steno was a monument to grief, taller than a man, her skin the color of wet stone, her arms a lattice of ancient scars, her head a nest of bronze wire that seemed to absorb the light.
Beside her, Euryale was a coil of restless energy, all sinew and mottled green scale, her golden boar's tusks gleaming, her eyes burning with a hunter's joy. Little sister, Steno's thought boomed in Medusa's mind, a grinding tectonic pressure. The story is over. The imbalance will be corrected. You have played with the soft things long enough, Euryale's thought hissed, sharp and quick. Come, it is time to be unmade. Medusa felt the old fear, the instinct to flee, to hide. But then she felt Alara's hand, small and warm, grip the edge of her robe. She heard a choked sob from a woman in the crowd, a mother who had just shaken off the unnatural grief. She saw the city, her city, groaning under the weight of her family's oppressive nature. My story is my own, Medusa said, her voice ringing out in the silence, a clear, cold bell of defiance, and you have no place in it anymore. She began to walk towards them, a lone goddess marching to face the tide. At that moment, a procession emerged from the city gates, led by Praxos. He was flanked by city guards, but they were a mere formality. The focus of the procession was a heavy cart pulled by 4 black oxen, carrying a large object veiled in a simple linen cloth. They did not head for the harbor, but turned, beginning the slow climb up Mount Lycovitus, towards the newly consecrated spring. Euryale's head snapped towards the movement, her predatory senses drawn to the organized action. A final, pointless ritual. The soft things love their little ceremonies before they are eaten. She took a step forward, but Steno's heavy hand on her shoulder stopped her. The nexus is the source of the imbalance, the mighty one's thought ground out. She must be undone first. They focused their immense psychic will on Medusa. The world around her seemed to dissolve into a gray vortex of sorrow and hunger. The sounds of the city vanished. The faces of her people blurred. She was back in the cave, small and mortal and terrified, the weight of their immortal contempt pressing down on her, crushing her nascent divinity. But this time, something was different. A new sound pierced the gray fog. It was a single, wavering voice, Alara. The girl had fallen to her knees, but she was singing. It was the hymn the poet had left, the hymn to the Lady of Unjust Sorrows. Her voice was joined by another, then 10, then 100. The people of Argos, fighting the psychic oppression, clung to the one solid thing in their world, their new goddess. Their collective voice, a chorus of shared pain and newfound faith, rose into the air. It was a shield, a mortal shield of belief, forged in the recognition of her suffering. The psychic pressure lessened. Medusa could breathe again. She looked at her sisters, and for the first time, she did not see unstoppable forces. She saw what they were: static, unchanging, relics. They were trapped in their own nature, while she, through her pain and her mortality, had learned to grow. She turned her back on them and began to climb the mountain. They followed, their movements now hesitant. Her refusal to engage them on their terms, this strange retreat towards a place of power they did not understand, was a tactic for which their ancient minds had no precedent. She reached the spring just as Praxos's procession arrived. The water, which had been flowing clear and cold, began to churn and darken at the proximity of Steno and Euryale. "Archon," Medusa said, her voice calm, "your offering." Praxos, his face pale but his hands steady, pulled